The Damned. Algernon Blackwood. Chapter I. I'm over 40, Francis, and rather set in my ways, I said good-naturedly, ready to yield if she insisted that our going together on the visit involved her happiness. My work is rather heavy just now too, as you know. The question is, could I work there with a lot of unassorted people in the house? Mabel doesn't mention any other people, Bill, was my sister's rejoinder. I gather she's alone as well as lonely. By the way she looked sideways out of the window at nothing, it was obvious she was disappointed, but to my surprise she did not urge the point. And as I glanced at Mrs. Franklin's invitation lying upon her sloping lap, the neat, childish handwriting conjured up a mental picture of the banker's widow, with her timid, insignificant personality, her pale gray eyes and her expression as of a backward child. I thought, too, of the roomy country mansion her late husband had altered to suit his particular needs, and of my visit to it, a few years ago, when its barren spaciousness suggested a wing of Kensington Museum fitted up temporarily as a place to eat and sleep in. Comparing it mentally with the poky Chelsea flat, where I and my sister kept impecunious house, I realized other points as well. Unworthy details flashed across me to entice. The fine library, the organ, the quiet workroom I should have, perfect service, the delicious cup of early tea, and hot baths at any moment of the day without a geyser. It's a longish visit, a month, isn't it? I hedged, smiling at the details that seduced me and ashamed of my man's selfishness, yet knowing that Francis expected it of me. There are points about it, I admit. If you're set on my going with you, I could manage it all right. I spoke at length in this way because my sister made no answer. I saw her tired eyes gazing into the dreariness of Oakley Street and felt a pang strike through me. After a pause, in which again she said no word, I added, "So, when you write the letter, you might hint, perhaps, that I usually work all the morning and Durham not a very lively visitor. Then she'll understand, you see." And I half rose to return to my diminutive study, where I was slaving, just then, at an absorbing article on comparative aesthetic values in the blind and deaf. But Francis did not move. She kept her gray eyes upon Oakley Street, where the evening mist from the river drew mournful perspectives into view. It was late October. We heard the omnibuses thundering across the bridge. The monotony of that broad, characterless street seemed more than usually depressing. Even in June sunshine it was dead, but with autumn, its melancholy soaked into every house between King's Road and the Embankment. It washed thought into the past, instead of inviting it hopefully towards the future. For me, its easy width was an avenue through which nameless slums across the river sent creeping messages of depression, and I always regarded it as winter's main entrance into London fog, slush. Gloom trooped down it every November, waving their forbidding banners till March came to rout them. Its one claim upon my love was that the south wind swept sometimes unobstructed up it, soft with suggestions of the sea. These lugubrious thoughts I naturally kept to myself, though I never ceased to regret the little flat whose cheapness had seduced us. Now, as I watched my sister's impassive face, I realized that perhaps she, too, felt as I felt, yet brave woman without betraying it. "And look here, Fanny," I said, putting a hand upon her shoulder as I crossed the room, "it would be the very thing for you. You're worn out with catering and housekeeping. Mabel is your oldest friend besides, and you've hardly seen her since he died." "She's been abroad for a year, Bill, and only just came back," my sister interposed. "She came back rather unexpectedly, though I never thought she would go there to live." She stopped abruptly. Clearly, she was only speaking half her mind. "Probably," she went on, "Mabel wants to pick up old links again." "Naturally," I put in, "yourself chief among them." The veiled reference to the house I let pass. "It involved discussing the dead man, for one thing." "I feel I ought to go anyhow," she resumed, "and of course it would be jollier if you came too. You'd get in such a muddle here by yourself and eat wrong things and forget to air the rooms and everything." She looked up laughing. "Only," she added, "there's the British Museum." "But there's a big library there," I answered, "and all the books of reference I could possibly want. It was of you I was thinking. You could take up your painting again. You always sell half of what you paint. It would be a splendid rest too, and Sussex is a jolly country to walk in." "By all means, Fanny, I advise." Our eyes met, as I stammered in my attempts to avoid expressing the thought that hid in both our minds. My sister had a weakness for dabbling in the various, new theories of the day. And Mabel, who before her marriage had belonged to foolish societies for investigating the future life to the neglect of the present one, had fostered this undesirable tendency. Her amiable, impressionable temperament was open to every psychic wind that blew. I detested the whole business. But even more than this, I abhorred the later influence that Mr. Franklin had steeped his wife in, capturing her body and soul in his somber doctrines. I had dreaded lest my sister also might be caught. Now that she is alone again. I stopped short. Our eyes now made pretense impossible, for the truth had slipped out inevitably, stupidly, although unexpressed in definite language. We laughed, turning our faces a moment to look at other things in the room. Frances picked up a book and examined its cover as though she had made an important discovery, while I took my case out and lit a cigarette I did not want to smoke. We left the matter there. I went out of the room before further explanation could cause tension. Disagreements grow into discord from such tiny things-wrong adjectives or a chance inflection of the voice. Frances had a right to her views of life as much as I had. At least, I reflected comfortably, we had separated upon an agreement this time, recognized mutually, though not actually stated. And this point of meeting was, oddly enough, our way of regarding someone who was dead. For we had both disliked the husband with a great dislike, and during his 3 years, married life had only been to the house once for a weekend visit. Arriving late on Saturday, we had left after an early breakfast on Monday morning. Ascribing my sister's dislike to a natural jealousy at losing her old friend, I said merely that he displeased me. Yet we both knew that the real emotion lay much deeper. Frances, loyal, honorable creature, had kept silence. And beyond saying that house and grounds he altered one and laid out the other distressed her as an expression of his personality somehow, distressed, was the word she used, no further explanation had passed her lips. Our dislike of his personality was easily accounted for up to a point, since both of us shared the artist's point of view that a creed, cut to measure and carefully dried, was an ugly thing, and that a dogma to which believers must subscribe or perish everlastingly was a barbarism resting upon cruelty. But while my own dislike was purely due to an abstract worship of beauty, my sister's had another twist in it, for with her new tendencies, she believed that all religions were an aspect of truth and that no one, even the lowest wretch, could escape heaven in the long run. Samuel Franklin, the rich banker, was a man universally respected and admired, and the marriage, though Mabel was 15 years his junior, won general applause. His bride was an heiress in her own right breweries and the story of her conversion at a revivalist meeting where Samuel Franklin had spoken fervidly of heaven, and terrifyingly of sin, hell, and damnation, even contained a touch of genuine romance. She was a brand snatched from the burning. His detailed eloquence had frightened her into heaven. Salvation came in the nick of time. His words had plucked her from the edge of that lake of fire and brimstone where their worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched. She regarded him as a hero, sighed her relief upon his saintly shoulder, and accepted the peace he offered her with a grateful resignation. For her husband was a religious man who successfully combined great riches with the glamour of winning souls. He was a portly figure, though tall, with masterful, big hands, his fingers rather thick and red, and his dignity, that just escaped being pompous, held in it something that was implacable. A convinced assurance, almost remorseless, gleamed in his eyes when he preached especially, and his threats of hell fire must have scared souls stronger than the timid, receptive Mabel whom he married. He clad himself in long frock coats hat buttoned unevenly, big square boots, and trousers that invariably bagged at the knee and were a little short. He wore low collars, spats occasionally, and a tall black hat that was not of silk. His voice was alternately hard and unctuous, and he regarded theaters, ballrooms, and racecourses as the vestibule of that brimstone lake of whose geography he was as positive as of his great banking offices in the city. A philanthropist up to the hilt, however, no one ever doubted his complete sincerity. His convictions were ingrained, his faith borne out by his life as witness his name upon so many admirable societies, as treasurer, patron, or heading the donation list. He bulked large in the world of doing good, a broad and stately stone in the rampart against evil. And his heart was genuinely kind and soft for others who believed as he did. Yet, in spite of this true sympathy with suffering and his desire to help, he was narrow as a telegraph wire and unbending as a church pillar. He was intensely selfish. Intolerant as an officer of the Inquisition, his bourgeois soul constructed a revolting scheme of heaven that was reproduced in miniature in all he did and planned. Faith was the sine qua non of salvation, and by faith he meant belief in his own particular view of things, which faith, except every one do keep whole and undefiled, without doubt he shall perish everlastingly. All the world but his own small, exclusive sect must be damned eternally a pity, but alas, inevitable. He was right. Yet he prayed without ceasing, and gave heavily to the poor, the only thing he could not give being big ideas to his provincial and suburban deity. Pettier than an insect and more obstinate than a mule, he had also the superior, sleek humility of a chosen one. He was churchwarden, too. He read the lesson in a place of worship, either chilly or overheated, where neither organ, vestments, nor lighted candles were permitted, but where the odor of hair wash on the boys' heads in the back rows pervaded the entire building. This portrait of the banker, who accumulated riches both on earth and in heaven, may possibly be overdrawn, however, because Francis and I were artistic temperaments that viewed the type with a dislike and distrust amounting to contempt. The majority considered Samuel Franklin a worthy man and a good citizen. The majority, doubtless, held the saner view. A few years more, and he certainly would have been made a baronet. He relieved much suffering in the world, as assuredly as he caused many souls the agonies of torturing fear by his emphasis upon damnation. Had there been one point of beauty in him, we might have been more lenient. Only we found it not, and, I admit, took little pains to search. I shall never forget the look of dour forgiveness with which he heard our excuses for missing morning prayers that Sunday morning of our single visit to the Towers. My sister learned that a change was made soon afterwards, prayers being conducted after breakfast instead of before. The Towers stood solemnly upon a Sussex hill amid park-like modern grounds. But the house cannot better be described. It would be so wearisome for one thing then, by saying that it was a cross between an overgrown, pretentious Norwood villa and one of those saturnine institutes for cripples the train passes as it slinks ashamed through South London into Surrey. It was wealthily furnished and at first sight imposing, but on closer acquaintance revealed a meager personality, barren and austere. One looked for rules and regulations on the walls, all signed by order. The place was a prison that shut out the world. There was, of course, no billiard room, no smoking room, no room for play of any kind, and the great hall at the back, once a chapel, which might have been used for dancing, theatricals, or other innocent amusements, was consecrated in his day to meetings of various kinds, chiefly brigades, temperance or missionary societies. There was a harmonium at one end on the level flora-raised dais or platform at the other, and a gallery above for the servants, gardeners, and coachmen. It was heated with hot water pipes, and hung with Dore Abreve copyright S pictures, though these latter were soon removed and stored out of sight in the attics as being too unspiritual. In polished, shiny wood, it was a representation in miniature of that poky exclusive heaven he took about with him, externalizing it in all he did and planned, even in the grounds about the house. Changes in the Towers, Francis told me, had been made during Mabel's year of widowhood. Abroad an organ put into the big hall. The library made livable and recatalogued when it was permissible to suppose she had found her soul again and returned to her normal, healthy views of life, which included enjoyment and play, literature, music, and the arts, without, however, a touch of that trivial thoughtlessness usually termed worldliness. Mrs. Franklin, as I remembered her, was a quiet little woman, shallow, perhaps, and easily influenced, but sincere as a dog and thorough in her faithful friendship. Her tastes at heart were Catholic, and that heart was simple and unimaginative. That she took up with the various movements of the day was sign merely that she was searching in her limited way for a belief that should bring her peace. She was, in fact, a very ordinary woman, her caliber a little less than that of Francis. I knew they used to discuss all kinds of theories together, but as these discussions never resulted in action, I had come to regard her as harmless. Still, I was not sorry when she married, and I did not welcome now a renewal of the former intimacy. The philanthropist she had given no children, or she would have made a good and sensible mother. No doubt she would marry again. Mabel mentions that she's been alone at the Towers since the end of August, Frances told me at tea time, and I'm sure she feels out of it and lonely. It would be a kindness to go. Besides, I always liked her. I agreed. I had recovered from my attack of selfishness. I expressed my pleasure. You've written to accept, I said, half statement and half question. Frances nodded. I thanked for you, she added quietly, explaining that you were not free at the moment, but that later, if not inconvenient, you might come down for a bit and join me. I stared. Frances sometimes had this independent way of deciding things. I was convicted and punished into the bargain. Of course, there followed argument and explanation, as between brother and sister who were affectionate, but the recording of our talk could be of little interest. It was arranged thus, Frances and I both satisfied. 2 days later, she departed for the Towers, leaving me alone in the flat with everything planned for my comfort and good behavior. She was rather a tyrant in her quiet way, and her last words, as I saw her off from Charing Cross, rang in my head for a long time after she was gone. I'll write and let you know, Bill. Eat properly, mind, and let me know if anything goes wrong. She waved her small gloved hand, nodded her head till the feather brushed the window, and was gone. Chapter A. After the note announcing her safe arrival, a week of silence passed, and then a letter came. There were various suggestions for my welfare, and the rest was the usual rambling information and description Frances loved, generously italicized. And we are quite alone, she went on in her enormous handwriting that seemed such a waste of space and labor. Though some others are coming presently, I believe. You could work here to your heart's content. Mabel quite understands and says she would love to have you when you feel free to come. She has changed a bit back to her old natural self. She never mentions him. The place has changed too in certain ways. It has more cheerfulness, I think. She has put it in, this cheerfulness, spaded it in, if you know what I mean, but it lies about uneasily and is not natural quite. The organ is a beauty. She must be very rich now, but she's as gentle and sweet as ever. Do you know, Bill, I think he must have frightened her into marrying him. I get the impression she was afraid of him. This last sentence was inked out, but I read it through the scratching, the letters being too big to hide. He had an inflexible will beneath all that oily kindness which passed for spiritual. He was a real personality, I mean. I'm sure he'd have sent you and me cheerfully to the stake in another century for our own good. Isn't it odd she never speaks of him, even to me? This, again, was stroked through, though without the intention to obliterate merely, because it was repetition, probably. The only reminder of him in the house now is a big copy of the presentation portrait that stands on the stairs of the Multitechnic Institute at Peckham. Know that life-size one, with his fat hand, sprinkled with rings resting on a thick Bible, and the other slipped between the buttons of a tight frock coat. It hangs in the dining room and rather dominates our meals. I wish Mabel would take it down. I think she'd like to, if she dared. There's not a single photograph of him anywhere, even in her own room. Mrs. Marsh is here, you remember her, his housekeeper, the wife of the man who got penal servitude for killing a baby or something. You said she robbed him and justified her stealing, because the story of the unjust steward was in the Bible. How we laughed over that. She's just the same too, gliding about all over the house and turning up when least expected. Other reminiscences filled the next 2 sides of the letter, and ran, without a trace of punctuation, into instructions about a salamander stove for heating my workroom in the flat. These were followed by things I was to tell the cook, and by requests for several articles she had forgotten and would like sent after her, 2 of them blouses, with descriptions so lengthy and contradictory that I sighed as I read them. Unless you come down soon, in which case perhaps you wouldn't mind bringing them. Not the mauve one I wear in the evening sometimes, but the pale blue one with lace round the collar and the crinkly front. They're in the cupboard or the drawer, I'm not sure which of my bedroom. Ask Annie if you're in doubt. Thanks most awfully. Send a telegram, remember, and we'll meet you in the motor any time. I don't quite know if I shall stay the whole month alone. It all depends. And she closed the letter, the italicized words increasing recklessly towards the end, with a repetition that Mabel would love to have me for myself, as also to have a man in the house, and that I only had to telegraph the day and the train. This letter, coming by the second post, interrupted me in a moment of absorbing work, and having read it through to make sure there was nothing requiring instant attention, I threw it aside and went on with my notes and reading. Within 5 minutes, however, it was back at me again. That restless thing called between the lines fluttered about my mind. My interest in the Balkan States political article that had been ordered faded. Somewhere, somehow I felt disquieted, disturbed. At first I persisted in my work, forcing myself to concentrate, but soon found that a layer of new impressions floated between the article and my attention. It was like a shadow, though a shadow that dissolved upon inspection. Once or twice I glanced up, expecting to find someone in the room, that the door had opened unobserved and Annie was waiting for instructions. I heard the buses thundering across the bridge. I was aware of Oakley Street. Montenegro and the blue Adriatic melted into the October haze along that depressing embankment that aped a riverbank, and sentences from the letter flashed before my eyes and stung me. Picking it up and reading it through more carefully, I rang the bell and told Annie to find the blouses and pack them for the post, showing her finally the written description and resenting the superior smile with which she at once interrupted. "I know them, sir," and disappeared. But it was not the blouses. It was that exasperating thing, between the lines, that put an end to my work with its elusive teasing nuisance. The first sharp impression is alone of value in such a case, for once analysis begins, the imagination constructs all kinds of false interpretation. The more I thought, the more I grew fuddled. The letter, it seemed to me, wanted to say another thing, instead the 8 sheets conveyed it merely. It came to the edge of disclosure, then halted. There was something on the writer's mind, and I felt uneasy. Studying the sentences brought, however, no revelation, but increased confusion only, for while the uneasiness remained, the first clear hint had vanished. In the end, I closed my books and went out to look up another matter at the British Museum Library. Perhaps I should discover it that way by turning the mind in a totally new direction. I lunched at the Express Dairy in Oxford Street close by, and telephoned to Annie that I would be home to tea at 5. And at tea, tired physically and mentally after breathing the exhausted air of the rotunda for 5 hours, my mind suddenly delivered up its original impression, vivid and clear-cut. No proof accompanied the revelation. It was mere presentiment, but convincing. Frances was disturbed in her mind, her orderly, sensible, housekeeping mind. She was uneasy, even perhaps afraid. Something in the house distressed her, and she had need of me. Unless I went down, her time of rest and change, her quite necessary holiday, in fact, would be spoilt. She was too unselfish to say this, but it ran everywhere between the lines. I saw it clearly now. Mrs. Franklin, moreover, and that meant Frances too would like a man in the house. It was a disagreeable phrase, a suggestive way of hinting something she dared not state definitely. The 2 women in that great, lonely barrack of a house were afraid. My sense of duty, affection, unselfishness, whatever the composite emotion may be termed, was stirred, also my vanity. I acted quickly, lest reflection should warp clear, decent judgment. "Annie," I said, when she answered the bell, "you need not send those blouses by the post. I'll take them down tomorrow when I go. I shall be away a week or 2, possibly longer." And, having looked up a train, I hastened out to telegraph before I could change my fickle mind. But no desire came that night to change my mind. I was doing the right, the necessary thing. I was even in something of a hurry to get down to the Towers as soon as possible. I chose an early afternoon train. Chapter EI. A telegram had told me to come to a town 10 miles from the house, so I was saved the crawling train to the local station and traveled down by an express. As soon as we left London, the fog cleared off, and an autumn sun, though without heat in it, painted the landscape with golden browns and yellows. My spirits rose as I lay back in the luxurious motor and sped between the woods and hedges. Oddly enough, my anxiety of overnight had disappeared. It was due, no doubt, to that exaggeration of detail which reflection in loneliness brings. Frances and I had not been separated for over a year, and her letters from the Towers told so little. It had seemed unnatural to be deprived of those intimate particulars of mood and feeling I was accustomed to. We had such confidence in one another, and our affection was so deep. Though she was but 5 years younger than myself, I regarded her as a child. My attitude was fatherly. In return, she certainly mothered me with a solicitude that never cloyed. I felt no desire to marry while she was still alive. She painted in watercolors with a reasonable success and kept house for me. I wrote, reviewed books, and lectured on aesthetics. We were a humdrum couple of quasi-artists, well satisfied with life, and all I feared for her was that she might become a suffragette or be taken captive by one of these wild theories that caught her imagination sometimes, and that Mabel, for one, had fostered. As for myself, no doubt she deemed me a trifle solid or stolid, I forget which word she preferred, but on the whole, there was just sufficient difference of opinion to make intercourse suggestive without monotony, and certainly without quarreling. Drawing in deep draughts of the stinging autumn air, I felt happy and exhilarated. It was like going for a holiday, with comfort at the end of the journey instead of bargaining for centimes. But my heart sank noticeably the moment the house came into view. The long drive, lined with hostile monkey trees and formal Wellingtonias that were solemn and sedate, was mere extension of the miniature approach to 1,000 semi-detached suburban residences, and the appearance of the towers, as we turned the corner with a rush, suggested a commonplace climax to a story that had begun interestingly, almost thrillingly. A villa had escaped from the shadow of the Crystal Palace, thumped its way down by night, grown suddenly monstrous in a shower of rich rain, and settled itself insolently to stay. Ivy climbed about the opulent red brick walls, but climbed neatly and with disfiguring effect, sham as on a prison, or the simile made me smile an orphan asylum. There was no hint of the comely roughness of untidy ivy on a ruin. Clipped, trained, and precise it was, as on a brand-new Protestant church. I swear there was not a bird's nest, nor a single earwig in it anywhere. About the porch it was particularly thick, smothering a 17th-century lamp with a contrast that was quite horrible. Extensive glass houses spread away on the farther side of the house. The numerous towers to which the building owed its name seemed made to hold school bells, and the windowsills, thick with potted flowers, made me think of the desolate suburbs of Brighton or Bexhill. In a commanding position upon the crest of a hill, it overlooked miles of undulating, wooded country southwards to the downs, but behind it, to the north, thick banks of ilex, holly, and privet protected it from the cleaner and more stimulating winds. Hence, though highly placed, it was shut in. 3 years had passed since I last set eyes upon it, but the unsightly memory I had retained was justified by the reality. The place was deplorable. It is my habit to express my opinions audibly sometimes, when impressions are strong enough to warrant it, but now I only sighed, "Oh, dear," as I extricated my legs from many rugs and went into the house. A tall parlour-maid, with the bearing of a grenadier, received me, and standing behind her was Mrs. Marsh, the housekeeper, whom I remembered because her untidy back hair had suggested to me that it had been burnt. I went at once to my room, my hostess already dressing for dinner, but Frances came in to see me just as I was struggling with my black tie that had got tangled like a bootlace. She fastened it for me in a neat, effective bow, and while I held my chin up for the operation, staring blankly at the ceiling, the impression came I wondered, was it her touch that caused it? That something in her trembled. Shrinking perhaps is the truer word. Nothing in her face or manner betrayed it, nor in her pleasant, easy talk while she tidied my things and scolded my slovenly packing, as her habit was, questioning me about the servants at the flat. The blouses, though right, were crumpled, and my scolding was deserved. There was no impatience even, yet somehow or other the suggestion of a shrinking reserve and holding back reached my mind. She had been lonely, of course, but it was more than that. She was glad that I had come, yet for some reason unstated she could have wished that I had stayed away. We discussed the news that had accumulated during our brief separation, and in doing so the impression, at best exceedingly slight, was forgotten. My chamber was large and beautifully furnished. The hall and dining room of our flat would have gone into it with a good remainder, yet it was not a place I could settle down in for work. It conveyed the idea of impermanence, making me feel transient as in a hotel bedroom. This, of course, was the fact. But some rooms convey a settled, lasting hospitality even in a hotel. This one did not. And as I was accustomed to work in the room I slept in, at least when visiting, a slight frown must have crept between my eyes. "Mabel has fitted a workroom for you just out of the library," said the clairvoyant Frances. "No one will disturb you there, and you'll have 15,000 books all catalogued within easy reach. There's a private staircase, too. You can breakfast in your room and slip down in your dressing gown if you want to." She laughed. My spirits took a turn upwards as absurdly as they had gone down. "And how are you?" I asked, giving her a belated kiss. "It's jolly to be together again. I did feel rather lost without you, I'll admit." "That's natural," she laughed. "I'm so glad." She looked well and had country color in her cheeks. She informed me that she was eating and sleeping well, going out for little walks with Mabel, painting bits of scenery again, and enjoying a complete change and rest. And yet, for all her brave description, the words somehow did not quite ring true. Those last words in particular did not ring true. There lay in her manner, just out of sight, I felt, this suggestion of the exact reverse of unrest, shrinking, almost of anxiety. Certain small strings in her seemed overtight. "Keyed up" was the slang expression that crossed my mind. I looked rather searchingly into her face as she was telling me this. "Only the evenings," she added, noticing my query, yet rather avoiding my eyes. "The evenings are, well, rather heavy sometimes, and I find it difficult to keep awake." "The strong air after London makes you drowsy," I suggested, "and you like to get early to bed." Frances turned and looked at me for a moment steadily. "On the contrary, Bill, I dislike going to bed here, and Mabel goes so early." She said it lightly enough, fingering the disorder upon my dressing table in such a stupid way that I saw her mind was working in another direction altogether. She looked up suddenly, with a kind of nervousness from the brush and scissors. "Billy," she said abruptly, lowering her voice, "isn't it odd, but I hate sleeping alone here. I can't make it out quite. I've never felt such a thing before in my life. Do you think it's all nonsense?" And she laughed, with her lips but not with her eyes. There was a note of defiance in her I failed to understand. "Nothing a nature like yours feels strongly is nonsense, Frances," I replied soothingly. But I, too, answered with my lips only, for another part of my mind was working elsewhere, and among uncomfortable things. A touch of bewilderment passed over me. I was not certain how best to continue. If I laughed, she would tell me no more, yet if I took her too seriously, the strings would tighten further. Instinctively, then, this flashed rapidly across me. That something of what she felt, I had also felt, though interpreting it differently. Vague it was, as the coming of rain or storm that announced themselves hours in advance with their hint of faint, unsettling excitement in the air. I had been but a short hour in the house-big, comfortable, luxurious house, but had experienced this sense of being unsettled, unfixed, fluctuating, a kind of impermanence that transient lodgers in hotels must feel, but that a guest in a friend's home ought not to feel, be the visit short or long. To Frances, an impressionable woman, the feeling had come in the terms of alarm. She disliked sleeping alone, while yet she longed to sleep. The precise idea in my mind evaded capture, merely brushing through me, 3/4 out of sight. I realized only that we both felt the same thing, and that neither of us could get at it clearly. Degrees of unrest we felt, but the actual thing did not disclose itself. It did not happen. I felt strangely at sea for a moment. Frances would interpret hesitation as endorsement, and encouragement might be the last thing that could help her. "Sleeping in a strange house," I answered at length, "is often difficult at first, and one feels lonely. After 15 months in our tiny flat, one feels lost and uncared for in a big house. It's an uncomfortable feeling, I know it well. And this is a barrack, isn't it? The masses of furniture only make it worse. One feels in storage, somewhere underground the furniture doesn't furnish. One must never yield to fancies, though." Frances looked away towards the windows. She seemed disappointed a little. "After our thickly populated Chelsea," I went on quickly, "it seems isolated here." But she did not turn back, and clearly I was saying the wrong thing. A wave of pity rushed suddenly over me. Was she really frightened, perhaps? She was imaginative, I knew, but never moody. Common sense was strong in her, though she had her times of hypersensitiveness. I caught the echo of some unreasoning, big alarm in her. She stood there, gazing across my balcony towards the sea of wooded country that spread dim and vague in the obscurity of the dusk. The deepening shadows entered the room, I fancied, from the grounds below. Following her abstracted gaze a moment, I experienced a curious, sharp desire to leave, to escape. Out yonder was wind and space and freedom. This enormous building was oppressive, silent, still. Great catacombs occurred to me, things beneath the ground, imprisonment and capture. I believe I even shuddered a little. I touched her shoulder. She turned round slowly, and we looked with a certain deliberation into each other's eyes. "Fanny," I asked, more gravely than I intended, "you are not frightened, are you? Nothing has happened, has it?" She replied with emphasis, "Of course not. How could it? I mean, why should I?" she stammered, as though the wrong sentence flustered her a second. "It's simply that I have this dislike of sleeping alone." Naturally, my first thought was how easy it would be to cut our visit short, but I did not say this. Had it been a true solution, Francis would have said it for me long ago. "Wouldn't Mabel double up with you?" I said instead, "or give you an adjoining room so that you could leave the door between you open? There's space enough, heaven knows." And then, as the gong sounded in the hall below for dinner, she said, as with an effort, this thing. "Mabel did ask me on the third night after I had told her, but I declined." "You'd rather be alone than with her?" I asked with a certain relief. Her reply was so gravely given, a child would have known there was more behind it. Not that, but that she did not really want it. I had a moment's intuition and acted on it impulsively. She feels it too, perhaps, but wishes to face it by herself and get over it. My sister bowed her head, and the gesture made me realize of a sudden how grave and solemn our talk had grown, as though some portentous thing were under discussion. It had come of itself indefinite as a gradual change of temperature. Yet neither of us knew its nature, for apparently neither of us could state it plainly. Nothing happened, even in our words. "That was my impression," she said, "that if she yields to it, she encourages it, and a habit forms so easily. Just think," she added with a faint smile that was the first sign of lightness she had yet betrayed, "what a nuisance it would be everywhere if everybody was afraid of being alone like that." I snatched readily at the chance. We laughed a little, though it was a quiet kind of laughter that seemed wrong. I took her arm and led her towards the door. Disastrous, in fact, I agreed. She raised her voice to its normal pitch again, as I had done. "No doubt it will pass," she said, "now that you have come. Of course, it's chiefly my imagination." Her tone was lighter, though nothing could convince me that the matter itself was light just then. And in any case, tightening her grip on my arm as we passed into the bright, enormous corridor and caught sight of Mrs. Franklin waiting in the cheerless hall below. "I'm very glad you're here. Bill and Mabel, I know, is too. If it doesn't pass," I just had time to whisper with a feeble attempt at jollity, "I'll come at night and snore outside your door. After that, you'll be so glad to get rid of me that you won't mind being alone." "That's a bargain," said Francis. I shook my hostess by the hand, made a banal remark about the long interval since last we met, and walked behind them into the great dining room, dimly lit by candles, wondering in my heart how long my sister and I should stay, and why in the world we had ever left our cozy little flat to enter this desolation of riches and false luxury at all. The unsightly picture of the late Samuel Franklin, Esquire, stared down upon me from the farther end of the room above the mighty mantelpiece. He looked, I thought, like some pompous heavenly butler who denied to all the world, and to us in particular, the right of entry without presentation cards signed by his hand as proof that we belonged to his own exclusive set. The majority, to his deep grief, and in spite of all his prayers on their behalf, must burn and perish everlastingly. Chapter IV. With the instinct of the healthy bachelor, I always try to make myself a nest in the place I live in, be it for long or short. Whether visiting, in lodging house, or in hotel, the first essential is this nest one's own things built into the walls as a bird builds in its feathers. It may look desolate and uncomfortable enough to others, because the central detail is neither bed nor wardrobe, sofa nor armchair, but a good solid writing table that does not wriggle, and that has wide elbow room. And the Towers is vividly described for me by the single fact that I could not nest there. I took several days to discover this, but the first impression of impermanence was truer than I knew. The feathers of the mind refused here to lie one way. They ruffled, pointed, and grew wild. Luxurious furniture does not mean comfort. I might as well have tried to settle down in the sofa and armchair department of a big shop. My bedroom was easily managed. It was the private workroom, prepared especially for my reception, that made me feel alien and outcast. Externally, it was all one could desire. An antechamber to the great library, with not one, but 2 generous oak tables, to say nothing of smaller ones against the walls with capacious drawers. There were reading desks, mechanical devices for holding books, perfect light, quiet as in a church, and no approach but across the huge adjoining room. Yet it did not invite. "I hope you'll be able to work here," said my little hostess the next morning, as she took me in her only visit to it while I stayed in the house and showed me the 10-volume catalog. "It's absolutely quiet, and no one will disturb you." "If you can't, Bill, you're not much good," laughed Frances, who was on her arm. "Even I could write in a study like this." I glanced with pleasure at the ample tables, the sheets of thick blotting paper, the rulers, sealing wax, paper knives, and all the other immaculate paraphernalia. "It's perfect," I answered with a secret thrill, yet feeling a little foolish. This was for Gibbon or Carlyle rather than for my potbellying insignificancies. "If I can't write masterpieces here, it's certainly not your fault," and I turned with gratitude to Mrs. Franklin. She was looking straight at me, and there was a question in her small, pale eyes I did not understand. Was she noting the effect upon me? I wondered. "You'll write here perhaps a story about the house," she said. "Thompson will bring you anything you want, you only have to ring." She pointed to the electric bell on the central table, the wire running neatly down the leg. "No one has ever worked here before, and the library has been hardly used since it was put in. So there's no previous atmosphere to affect your imagination or adversely." We laughed. "Bill isn't that sort," said my sister, while I wished they would go out and leave me to arrange my little nest and set to work. I thought, of course, it was the huge listening library that made me feel so inconsiderable, the 15,000 silent, staring books, the solemn aisles, the deep, eloquent shelves. But when the women had gone and I was alone, the beginning of the truth crept over me, and I felt that first hint of disconsolateness which later became an imperative no. The mind shut down, images ceased to rise and flow. I read, made copious notes, but I wrote no single line at the towers. Nothing completed itself there, nothing happened. The morning sunshine poured into the library through 10 long, narrow windows. Birds were singing. The autumn air, rich with a faint aroma of November melancholy that stung the imagination pleasantly, filled my antechamber. I looked out upon the undulating wooded landscape, hemmed in by the sweep of distant downs, and I tasted a whiff of the sea. Rooks cawed as they floated above the elms, and there were lazy cows in the nearer meadows. A dozen times I tried to make my nest and settle down to work, and a dozen times, like a turning fastidious dog upon a hearth rug, I rearranged my chair and books and papers. The temptation of the catalog and shelves, of course, was accountable for much, yet not, I felt, for all. That was a manageable seduction. My work, moreover, was not of the creative kind that requires absolute absorption. It was the mere readable presentation of data I had accumulated. My notebooks were charged with facts ready to tabulate facts, too, that interested me keenly. A mere effort of the will was necessary, and concentration of no difficult kind. Yet somehow it seemed beyond me, something forever pushed the facts into disorder. And in the end I sat in the sunshine, dipping into a dozen books selected from the shelves outside, vexed with myself and only half enjoying it. I felt restless. I wanted to be elsewhere. And even while I read, attention wandered. Frances, Mabel, her late husband, the house and grounds, each in turn and sometimes all together, rose uninvited into the stream of thought, hindering any consecutive flow of work. In disconnected fashion came these pictures that interrupted concentration, yet presenting themselves as broken fragments of a bigger thing my mind already groped for unconsciously. They fluttered round this hidden thing of which they were aspects, fugitive interpretations, no one of them bringing complete revelation. There was no adjective, such as pleasant or unpleasant, that I could attach to what I felt, beyond that the result was unsettling. Vague as the atmosphere of a dream, it yet persisted, and I could not dissipate it. Isolated words or phrases in the lines I read sent questions scouring across my mind. Sure sign that the deeper part of me was restless and ill at ease. Rather trivial questions, too half-foolish interrogations, as of a puzzled or curious child. Why was my sister afraid to sleep alone, and why did her friend feel a similar repugnance, yet seek to conquer it? Why was the solid luxury of the house without comfort, its shelter without the sense of permanence? Why had Mrs. Franklin asked us to come, artists, unbelieving vagabonds, types at the farthest possible remove from the saved sheep of her husband's household? Had a reaction set in against the hysteria of her conversion? I had seen no signs of religious fervor in her. Her atmosphere was that of an ordinary, high-minded woman, yet a woman of the world. Lifeless, though, a little perhaps, now that I came to think about it. She had made no definite impression upon me of any kind, and my thoughts ran vaguely after this fragile clue. Closing my book, I let them run. For, with this chance reflection came the discovery that I could not see her clearly, could not feel her soul, her personality. Her face, her small pale eyes, her dress and body and walk, all these stood before me like a photograph, but herself evaded me. She seemed not there, lifeless, empty, a shadow, nothing. The picture was disagreeable, and I put it by. Instantly she melted out, as though light thought had conjured up a phantom that had no real existence. And at that very moment, singularly enough, my eye caught sight of her moving past the window, going silently along the gravel path. I watched her, a sudden new sensation gripping me. There goes a prisoner, my thought instantly ran, one who wishes to escape but cannot. What brought the outlandish notion, heaven only knows. The house was of her own choice, she was twice an heiress, and the world lay open at her feet. Yet she stayed unhappy, frightened, caught. All this flashed over me and made a sharp impression even before I had time to dismiss it as absurd. But a moment later explanation offered itself, though it seemed as far-fetched as the original impression. My mind, being logical, was obliged to provide something, apparently. For Mrs. Franklin, while dressed to go out, with thick walking boots, a pointed stick, and a motor cap tied on with a veil as for the windy lanes, was obviously content to go no farther than the little garden paths. The costume was a sham and a pretense. It was this, and her lithe, quick movements that suggested a caged creature, tamed by fear and cruelty that cloaked themselves in kindness spacing up and down, unable to realize why it got no farther, but always met the same bars in exactly the same place. The mind in her was barred. I watched her go along the paths and down the steps from one terrace to another until the laurels hid her altogether. And into this mere imagining of a moment came a hint of something slightly disagreeable, for which my mind, search as it would, found no explanation at all. I remembered then certain other little things. They dropped into the picture of their own accord. In a mind not deliberately hunting for clues, pieces of a puzzle sometimes come together in this way, bringing revelation, so that for a second there flashed across me, vanishing instantly again before I could consider it, a large, distressing thought. I can only describe vaguely as a shadow. Dark and ugly, oppressive certainly it might be described, with something torn and dreadful about the edges that suggested pain and strife and terror. The interior of a prison with 2 rows of occupied condemned cells, seen years ago in New York, sprang to memory after it, the connection between the two impossible to surmise even. But the certain other little things mentioned above were these. That Mrs. Franklin in last night's dinner talk had always referred to this house, but never called it home, and had emphasized unnecessarily, for a well-bred woman, our great kindness in coming down to stay so long with her. Another time, in answer to my futile compliment about the stately rooms, she said quietly, "It is an enormous house for so small a party, but I stay here very little, and only till I get it straight again." The 3 of us were going up the great staircase to bed as this was said, and not knowing quite her meaning, I dropped the subject. It edged delicate ground, I felt. Frances added no word of her own. It now occurred to me abruptly that stay was the word made use of, when live would have been more natural. How insignificant to recall, yet why did they suggest themselves just at this moment? And on going to Frances's room to make sure she was not nervous or lonely, I realized abruptly that Mrs. Franklin, of course, had talked with her in a confidential sense that I, as a mere visiting brother, could not share. Frances had told me nothing. I might easily have wormed it out of her, had I not felt that for us to discuss further our hostess and her house merely because we were under the roof together was not quite nice or loyal. "I'll call you, Bill, if I'm scared," she had laughed as we parted, my room being just across the big corridor from her own. I had fallen asleep, thinking what in the world was meant by getting it straight again. And now in my antechamber to the library, on the second morning, sitting among piles of foolscap and sheets of spotless blotting paper, all useless to me, these slight hints came back and helped to frame the big, vague shadow I have mentioned. Up to the neck in this shadow, almost drowned, yet just treading water, stood the figure of my hostess in her walking costume. Frances and I seemed swimming to her aid. The shadow was large enough to include both house and grounds, but farther than that I could not see. Dismissing it, I fell to reading my purloined book again. Before I turned another page, however, another startling detail leaped out at me. The figure of Mrs. Franklin in the shadow was not living. It floated helplessly, like a doll or puppet that has no life in it. It was both pathetic and dreadful. Anyone who sits in reverie thus, of course, may see similar ridiculous pictures when the will no longer guides construction. The incongruities of dreams are thus explained. I merely record the picture as it came. That it remained by me for several days, just as vivid dreams do, is neither here nor there. I did not allow myself to dwell upon it. The curious thing, perhaps, is that from this moment I date my inclination, though not yet my desire, to leave. I purposely say to leave. I cannot quite remember when the word changed to that aggressive, frantic thing, which is escape. Chapter V. We were left delightfully to ourselves in this pretentious country mansion, with the soul of a villa. Frances took up her painting again, and, the weather being propitious, spent hours out of doors, sketching flowers, trees, and nooks of woodland, garden, even the house itself where bits of it peered suggestively across the orchards. Mrs. Franklin seemed always busy about something or other, and never interfered with us except to propose motoring, tea in another part of the lawn, and so forth. She flitted everywhere, preoccupied, yet apparently doing nothing. The house engulfed her rather. No visitor called. For one thing, she was not supposed to be back from abroad yet. And for another, I think, the neighborhood her husband's neighborhood was puzzled by her sudden cessation from good works. Brigades and temperance societies did not ask to hold their meetings in the big hall. And the vicar arranged the school treats in another's field without explanation. The full-length portrait in the dining room, and the presence of the housekeeper with the burnt-back hair, indeed, were the only reminders of the man who once had lived here. Mrs. Marsh retained her place in silence, well-paid sinecure as it doubtless was, yet with no hint of that suppressed disapproval one might have expected from her. Indeed, there was nothing positive to disapprove, since nothing worldly entered grounds or building. In her master's lifetime she had been another brand snatched from the burning, and it had then been her custom to give vociferous testimony at the revival meetings where he adorned the platform and led in streams of prayer. I saw her sometimes on the stairs, hovering, wandering, half watching and half listening, and the idea came to me once that this woman somehow formed a link with the departed influence of her bigoted employer. She, alone among us, belonged to the house and looked at home there. When I saw her talking with such correct and respectful mien to Mrs. Franklin, I had the feeling that for all her unaggressive attitude, she yet exerted some influence that sought to make her mistress stay in the building forever live there. She would prevent her escape, prevent getting it straight again, thwart somehow her will to freedom if she could. The idea in me was of the most fleeting kind. But another time, when I came down late at night to get a book from the library antechamber, and found her sitting in the hall alone, the impression left upon me was the reverse of fleeting. I can never forget the vivid, disagreeable effect it produced upon me. What was she doing there at 11:30 at night, all alone in the darkness? She was sitting upright, stiff, in a big chair below the clock. It gave me a turn. It was so incongruous and odd. She rose quietly as I turned the corner of the stairs and asked me respectfully, her eyes cast down as usual, whether I had finished with the library so that she might lock up. There was no more to it than that, but the picture stayed with me unpleasantly. These various impressions came to me at odd moments, of course, and not in a single sequence as I now relate them. I was hard at work before 3 days were past, not writing, as explained, but reading, making notes, and gathering material from the library for future use. It was in chance moments that these curious flashes came, catching me unawares with a touch of surprise that sometimes made me start. For they proved that my undermind was still conscious of the shadow, and that far away out of sight lay the cause of it that left me with a vague unrest, unsettled, seeking to nest in a place that did not want me. Only when this deeper part knows harmony, perhaps, can good brainwork result, and my inability to write was thus explained. Certainly, I was always seeking for something here. I could not find an explanation that continually evaded me. Nothing but these trivial hints offered themselves. Lumped together, however, they had the effect of defining the shadow a little. I became more and more aware of its very real existence. And if I have made little mention of Frances and my hostess in this connection, it is because they contributed at first little or nothing towards the discovery of what this story tries to tell. Our life was wholly external, normal, quiet, and uneventful. Conversation banal, Mrs. Franklin's conversation in particular. They said nothing that suggested revelation. Both were in this shadow, and both knew that they were in it, but neither betrayed by word or act a hint of interpretation. They talked privately, no doubt, but of that I can report no details. And so it was that, after 10 days of a very commonplace visit, I found myself looking straight into the face of a strangeness that defied capture at close quarters. "There's something here that never happens," were the words that rose in my mind, and that's why none of us can speak of it. And as I looked out of the window and watched the vulgar blackbirds, with toes turned in, boring out their worms, I realized sharply that even they, as indeed everything large and small in the house and grounds, shared this strangeness, and were twisted out of normal appearance because of it. Life, as expressed in the entire place, was crumpled, dwarfed, emasculated. God's meanings here were crippled, his love of joy was stunted. Nothing in the garden danced or sang. There was hate in it. The shadow, my thought hurried on to completion, is a manifestation of hate, and hate is the devil. And then I sat back frightened in my chair, for I knew that I had partly found the truth. Leaving my books, I went out into the open. The sky was overcast, yet the day by no means gloomy, for a soft, diffused light oozed through the clouds and turned all things warm and almost summery. But I saw the grounds now in their nakedness because I understood. Hate means strife, and the two together weave the robe that terror wears. Having no so-called religious beliefs myself, nor belonging to any set of dogmas called a creed, I could stand outside these feelings and observe. Yet they soaked into me sufficiently for me to grasp sympathetically what others, with more cabin souls, I flattered myself, might feel. That picture in the dining room stalked everywhere, hid behind every tree, peered down upon me from the peaked ugliness of the bourgeois towers, and left the impress of its powerful hand upon every bed of flowers. "You must not do this, you must not do that," went past me through the air. "You must not leave these narrow paths," said the rigid iron railings of black. "You shall not walk here," was written on the lawns. "Keep to the steps. Don't pick the flowers. Make no noise of laughter, singing, dancing," was placarded all over the rose garden. "And trespassers will be not prosecuted but destroyed," hung from the crest of monkey tree and holly. Guarding the ends of each artificial terrace stood gaunt, implacable policemen, warders, jailers. "Come with us," they chanted, "or be damned eternally." I remember feeling quite pleased with myself that I had discovered this obvious explanation of the prison, feeling the place breathed out. That the posthumous influence of heavy old Samuel Franklin might be an inadequate solution did not occur to me. By getting the place straight again, his widow, of course, meant forgetting the glamour of fear and foreboding his depressing creed had temporarily forced upon her. And Frances, delicately minded being, did not speak of it because it was the influence of the man her friend had loved. I felt lighter, a load was lifted from me. To trace the unfamiliar to the familiar, came back a sentence I had read somewhere, is to understand. It was a real relief. I could talk with Frances now, even with my hostess, no danger of treading clumsily, for the key was in my hands. I might even help to dissipate the shadow, to get it straight again. It seemed, perhaps, our long invitation was explained. I went into the house laughing at myself a little. Perhaps after all the artist's outlook, with no hard and fast dogmas, is as narrow as the others. How small humanity is, and why is there no possible and true combination of all outlooks? The feeling of unsettling was very strong in me just then, in spite of my big discovery, which was to clear everything up. And at the moment, I ran into Frances on the stairs, with a portfolio of sketches under her arm. It came across me then abruptly that, although she had worked a great deal since we came, she had shown me nothing. It struck me suddenly as odd, unnatural. The way she tried to pass me now confirmed my newborn suspicion that her results were hardly what they ought to be. "Stand and deliver," I laughed, stepping in front of her. "I've seen nothing you've done since you've been here, and as a rule you show me all your things. I believe they are atrocious and degrading." Then my laughter froze. She made a sly gesture to slip past me, and I almost decided to let her go, for the expression that flashed across her face shocked me. She looked uncomfortable and ashamed. The color came and went a moment in her cheeks, making me think of a child detected in some secret naughtiness. It was almost fear. "It's because they're not finished then?" I said, dropping the tone of banter, "or because they're too good for me to understand?" For my criticism of painting, she told me, was crude and ignorant sometimes. "But you'll let me see them later, won't you?" Frances, however, did not take the way of escape I offered. She changed her mind. She drew the portfolio from beneath her arm instead. "You can see them if you really want to, Bill," she said quietly, and her tone reminded me of a nurse who says to a boy just grown out of childhood, "You are old enough now to look upon horror, and ugliness only, I don't advise it." "I do want to," I said, and made to go downstairs with her. But instead, she said in the same low voice as before, "Come up to my room, we shall be undisturbed there." So I guessed that she had been on her way to show the paintings to our hostess, but did not care for us all three to see them together. My mind worked furiously. "Mabel asked me to do them," she explained in a tone of submissive horror once the door was shut. "In fact, she begged it of me. You know how persistent she is in her quiet way. I had to." She flushed and opened the portfolio on the little table by the window, standing behind me as I turned the sketches over sketches of the grounds and trees and garden. In the first moment of inspection, however, I did not take in clearly why my sister's sense of modesty had been offended, for my attention flashed a second elsewhere. Another bit of the puzzle had dropped into place, defining still further the nature of what I called the shadow. Mrs. Franklin, I now remembered, had suggested to me in the library that I might perhaps write something about the place, and I had taken it for one of her banal sentences and paid no further attention. I realized now that it was said in earnest. She wanted our interpretations, as expressed in our respective talents, painting and writing. Her invitation was explained. She left us to ourselves on purpose. "I should like to tear them up," Frances was whispering behind me with a shudder. "Only I promised." She hesitated a moment. "Promise not to?" I asked with a queer feeling of distress, my eyes glued to the papers. "Promised always to show them to her first," she finished so low I barely caught it. I have no intuitive, immediate grasp of the value of paintings. Results come to me slowly, and though everyone believes his own judgment to be good, I dare not claim that mine is worth more than that of any other layman. Frances had too often convicted me of gross ignorance and error. I can only say that I examined these sketches with a feeling of amazement that contained revulsion, if not actually horror and disgust. They were outrageous. I felt hot for my sister, and it was a relief to know she had moved across the room on some pretense or other and did not examine them with me. Her talent, of course, is mediocre, yet she has her moments of inspiration moments, that is to say, when a view of beauty not normally her own flames divinely through her. And these interpretations struck me forcibly as being thus inspired, not her own. They were uncommonly well done. They were also atrocious. The meaning in them, however, was never more than hinted. There the unholy skill and power came in. They suggested so abominably, leaving most to the imagination. To find such significance in a bourgeois villa garden, and to interpret it with such delicate yet legible certainty, was a kind of symbolism that was sinister, even diabolical. The delicacy was her own, but the point of view was another's. And the word that rose in my mind was not the gross description of impure, but the more fundamental qualification, unpure. In silence, I turned the sketches over one by one, as a boy hurries through the pages of an evil book lest he be caught. "What does Mabel do with them?" I asked presently in a low tone as I neared the end. "Does she keep them?" "She makes notes about them in a book and then destroys them," was the reply from the end of the room. I heard a sigh of relief. "I'm glad you've seen them, Bill. I wanted you to but was afraid to show them. You understand?" "I understand," was my reply, though it was not a question intended to be answered. All I understood really was that Mabel's mind was as sweet and pure as my sister's, and that she had some good reason for what she did. She destroyed the sketches, but first made notes. It was an interpretation of the place she sought. Brother-like, I felt resentment, though, that Frances should waste her time and talent when she might be doing work that she could sell. Naturally, I felt other things as well. "Mabel pays me 5 guineas for each one," I heard. "Absolutely insists." I stared at her stupidly a moment, bereft of speech or wit. "I must either accept or go away," she went on calmly, but a little white. "I've tried everything. There was a scene the 3rd day I was here when I showed her my first result. I wanted to write to you, but hesitated." "It's unintentional, then, on your part. Forgive my asking it, Frances, dear," I blundered, hardly knowing what to think or say. Between the lines of her letter came back to me. "I mean, you make the sketches in your ordinary way, and the result comes out of itself, so to speak." She nodded, throwing her hands out like a Frenchman. "We needn't keep the money for ourselves, Bill. We can give it away, but I must either accept or leave," and she repeated the shrugging gesture. She sat down on the chair facing me, staring helplessly at the carpet. "You say there was a scene," I went on presently. "She insisted." "She begged me to continue," my sister replied very quietly. "She thinks that is, she has an idea or theory that there's something about the place, something she can't get at quite." Frances stammered badly. She knew I did not encourage her wild theories. "Something she feels, yes," I helped her, more than curious. "Oh, you know what I mean, Bill," she said desperately. "That the place is saturated with some influence that she is herself too positive or too stupid to interpret. She's trying to make herself negative and receptive, as she calls it, but can't, of course, succeed. Haven't you noticed how dull and impersonal and insipid she seems, as though she had no personality? She thinks impressions will come to her that way, but they don't. Naturally. So she's trying me us what she calls the sensitive and impressionable artistic temperament. She says that until she is sure exactly what this influence is, she can't fight it, turn it out, get the house straight, as she phrases it. Remembering my own singular impressions, I felt more lenient than I might otherwise have done. I tried to keep impatience out of my voice. "And this influence, whose is it?" We used the pronoun that followed in the same breath, for I answered my own question at the same moment as she did. "His." Our heads nodded involuntarily towards the floor, the dining room being directly underneath. And my heart sank, my curiosity died away on the instant. I felt bored. A commonplace haunted house was the last thing in the world to amuse or interest me. The mere thought exasperated, with its suggestions of imagination, overwrought nerves, hysteria, and the rest. Mingled with my other feelings was certainly disappointment. To see a figure or feel a presence, and report from day to day strange incidents to each other would be a form of weariness I could never tolerate. "But really, Frances," I said firmly, after a moment's pause, "it's too far-fetched, this explanation. A curse, you know, belongs to the ghost stories of early Victorian days, and only my positive conviction that there was something after all worth discovering, and that it most certainly was not this, prevented my suggesting that we terminate our visit forthwith, or as soon as we decently could. This is not a haunted house, whatever it is," I concluded somewhat vehemently, bringing my hand down upon her odious portfolio. My sister's reply revived my curiosity sharply. "I was waiting for you to say that. Mabel says exactly the same. He is in it, but it's something more than that alone, something far bigger and more complicated." Her sentence seemed to indicate the sketches, and though I caught the inference, I did not take it up, having no desire to discuss them with her, just them indeed, if ever. I merely stared at her and listened. Questions, I felt sure, would be of little use. It was better she should say her thought in her own way. He is one influence, the most recent, she went on slowly and always very calmly, but there are others deeper layers, as it were underneath. If his were the only one, something would happen, but nothing ever does happen. The others hinder and prevent as though each were struggling to predominate. I had felt it already myself. The idea was rather horrible. I shivered. That's what is so ugly about it, that nothing ever happens, she said. There is this endless anticipation always on the dry edge of a result that never materializes. It is torture. Mabel is at her wit's end, you see, and when she begged me what I felt about my sketches, she stammered badly as before. I stopped her. I had judged too hastily. That queer symbolism in her paintings, pagan and yet not innocent, was, I understood, the result of mixture. I did not pretend to understand, but at least I could be patient. I consequently held my peace. We did talk on a little longer, but it was more general talk that avoided successfully our hostess. The paintings, wild theories, and him until at length the emotion Francis had hitherto so successfully kept under burst vehemently forth again. It had hidden between her calm sentences, as it had hidden between the lines of her letter. It swept her now from head to foot, packed tight in the thing she then said. Then, Bill, if it is not an ordinary haunted house, she asked, what is it? The words were commonplace enough. The emotion was in the tone of her voice that trembled, in the gesture she made, leaning forward and clasping both hands upon her knees, and in the slight blanching of her cheeks as her brave eyes asked the question and searched my own with anxiety that bordered upon panic. In that moment she put herself under my protection. I winced. And why, she added, lowering her voice to a still and furtive whisper, does nothing ever happen? If only, this with great emphasis, something would happen, break this awful tension, bring relief. It's the waiting I cannot stand. And she shivered all over as she said it, a touch of wildness in her eyes. I would have given much to have made a true and satisfactory answer. My mind searched frantically for a moment, but in vain. There lay no sufficient answer in me. I felt what she felt, though with differences. No conclusive explanation lay within reach. Nothing happened. Eager as I was to shoot the entire business into the rubbish heap where ignorance and superstition discharge their poisonous weeds, I could not honestly accomplish this. To treat Frances as a child and merely explain away would be to strain her confidence in my protection, so affectionately claimed. It would further be dishonest to myself, weak, besides to deny that I had also felt the strain and tension even as she did. While my mind continued searching, I returned her stare in silence. And Frances then, with more honesty and insight than my own, gave suddenly the answer herself, an answer whose truth and adequacy, so far as they went, I could not readily gainsay. I think, Bill, because it is too big to happen here to happen anywhere, indeed, all at once and too awful. To have tossed the sentence aside as nonsense, argued it away, proved that it was really meaningless, would have been easy at any other time or in any other place. And, had the past week brought me none of the vivid impressions it had brought me, this is doubtless what I should have done. My narrowness again was proved. We understand in others only what we have in ourselves. But her explanation, in a measure, I knew was true. It hinted at the strife and struggle that my notion of a shadow had seemed to cover thinly. Perhaps, I murmured lamely, waiting in vain for her to say more. But you said just now that you felt the thing was in layers, as it were. Do you mean each influence fighting for the upper hand? I used her phraseology to conceal my own poverty. Terminology, after all, was nothing, provided we could reach the idea itself. Her eyes said yes. She had her clear conception, arrived at independently, as was her way. And unlike her sex, she kept it clear, unsmothered by too many words. One set of influences gets at me, another gets at you. It's according to our temperaments, I think. She glanced significantly at the vile portfolio. Sometimes they are mixed and therefore false. There has always been in me, more than in you, the pagan thing, perhaps, though never, thank God, like that. The frank confession, of course, invited my own, as it was meant to do. Yet it was difficult to find the words. What I have felt in this place, Frances, I honestly can hardly tell you, because my impressions have not arranged themselves in any definite form I can describe. The strife, the agony of vainly sought escape, and the unrest a sort of prison atmosphere this I have felt at different times and with varying degrees of strength. But I find, as yet, no final label to attach. I couldn't say pagan, Christian, or anything like that, I mean, as you do. As with the blind and deaf, you may have an intensification of certain senses denied to me, or even another sense altogether in embryo. Perhaps, she stopped me, anxious to keep to the point, you feel it as Mabel does. She feels the whole thing complete. That also is possible, I said very slowly. I was thinking behind my words. Her odd remark that it was big and awful came back upon me as true. A vast sensation of distress and discomfort swept me suddenly. Pity was in it, and a fierce contempt, a savage, bitter anger as well. Fury against some sham authority was part of it. Frances, I said, caught unawares and dropping all pretense, what in the world can it be? I looked hard at her. For some minutes neither of us spoke. Have you felt no desire to interpret it? She asked presently. Mabel did suggest my writing something about the house, was my reply, but I felt nothing imperative. That sort of writing is not my line, you know. My only feeling, I added, noticing that she waited for more, is the impulse to explain, discover, get it out of me somehow, and so get rid of it. Not by writing, though as yet. And again, I repeated my former question. What in the world do you think it is? My voice had become involuntarily hushed. There was awe in it. Her answer, given with slow emphasis, brought back all my reserve. The phraseology provoked me rather. Whatever it is, Bill, it is not of God. I got up to go downstairs. I believe I shrugged my shoulders. Would you like to leave, Frances? Shall we go back to town? I suggested this at the door, and hearing no immediate reply, I turned back to look. Frances was sitting with her head bowed over and buried in her hands. The attitude horribly suggested tears. No woman, I realized, can keep back the pressure of strong emotion as long as Frances had done, without ending in a fluid collapse. I waited a moment uneasily, longing to comfort, yet afraid to act, and, in this way, discovered the existence of the appalling emotion in myself, hitherto but half-guessed. At all costs a scene must be prevented. It would involve such exaggeration and overstatement. Brutally, such is the weakness of the ordinary man, I turned the handle to go out, but my sister then raised her head. The sunlight caught her face, framed untidily in its auburn hair, and I saw her wonderful expression with a start. Pity, tenderness, and sympathy shone in it like a flame. It was undeniable. There shone through all her features the imperishable love and yearning to sacrifice self for others which I have seen in only one type of human being. It was the great mother look. We must stay by Mabel and help her get it straight, she whispered, making the decision for us both. I murmured agreement. Abashed and half ashamed, I stole softly from the room and went out into the grounds. And the first thing clearly realized when alone was this, that the long scene between us was without definite result. The exchange of confidence was really nothing but hints and vague suggestion. We had decided to stay, but it was a negative decision not to leave rather than a positive action. All our words and questions, our guesses, inferences, explanations, our most subtle allusions and insinuations, even the odious paintings themselves, were without definite result. Nothing had happened. Chapter Vi. And instinctively, once alone, I made for the places where she had painted her extraordinary pictures. I tried to see what she had seen. Perhaps, now that she had opened my mind to another view, I should be sensitive to some similar interpretation and, possibly by way of literary expression. If I were to write about the place, I asked myself, how should I treat it? I deliberately invited an interpretation in the way that came easiest to me writing. But in this case, there came no such revelation. Looking closely at the trees and flowers, the bits of lawn and terrace, the rose garden and corner of the house where the flaming creeper hung so thickly, I discovered nothing of the odious, unpure thing her color and grouping had unconsciously revealed. At first, that is, I discovered nothing. The reality stood there, commonplace and ugly, side by side with her distorted version of it that lay in my mind. It seemed incredible. I tried to force it, but in vain. My imagination, plowed less deeply than hers or to another pattern, grew different seed. Where I saw the gross soul of an overgrown suburban garden, inspired by the spirit of a vulgar, rich revivalist who loved to preach damnation, she saw this rush of pagan liberty and joy. this strange license of primitive flesh which, tainted by the other, produced the adulterated, vile result. Certain things, however, gradually then became apparent, forcing themselves upon me willy-nilly. They came slowly but overwhelmingly. Not that facts had changed, or natural details altered in the grounds. This was impossible, but that I noticed for the first time various aspects I had not noticed before trivial enough. Yet for me, just then, significant. Some I remembered from previous days, others I saw now as I wandered to and fro, uneasy, uncomfortable almost. It seemed watched by someone who took note of my impressions. The details were so foolish, the total result so formidable. I was half aware that others tried hard to make me see. It was deliberate. My sister's phrase, "One layer got at me, another gets at you," flashed, undesired, upon me. For I saw, as with the eyes of a child, what I can only call a goblin garden house. Grounds, trees, and flowers belong to a goblin world that children enter through the pages of their fairy tales. And what made me first aware of it was the whisper of the wind behind me, so that I turned with a sudden start, feeling that something had moved closer. An old ash tree, ugly and ungainly, had been artificially trained to form an arbor at one end of the terrace that was a tennis lawn, and the leaves of it now went rustling together, swishing as they rose and fell. I looked at the ash tree and felt as though I had passed that moment between doors into this goblin garden that crouched behind the real one. Below, at a deeper layer perhaps, lay hidden the one my sister had entered. To deal with my own, however, I call it goblin, because an odd aspect of the quaint in it yet never quite achieved the picturesque. Grotesque, probably, is the truer word, for everywhere I noticed, and for the first time, this slight alteration of the natural due either to the exaggeration of some detail, or to its suppression, generally, I think, to the latter. Life everywhere appeared to me as blocked from the full delivery of its sweet and lovely message. Some counter-influence stopped its suppression, or sent it awry exaggeration. The house itself, mere expression, of course, of a narrow, limited mind, was sheer ugliness. It required no further explanation. With the grounds and garden, so far as shape and general plan were concerned, this was also true. But that trees and flowers and other natural details should share the same deficiency perplexed my logical soul and even dismayed it. I stood and stared, then moved about and stood and stared again. Everywhere was this mockery of a sinister, unfinished aspect. I sought in vain to recover my normal point of view. My mind had found this goblin garden and wandered to and fro in it, unable to escape. The change was in myself, of course, and so trivial were the details which illustrated it, that they sound absurd, thus mentioned one by one. For me, they proved it, is all I can affirm. The goblin touch lay plainly everywhere. In the forms of the trees, planted at neat intervals along the lawns, in this twisted ash that rustled just behind me, in the shadow of the gloomy Wellingtonias whose sweeping skirts obscured the grass. But especially, I noticed, in the tops and crests of them. For here, the delicate, graceful curves of last year's growth seemed to shrink back into themselves. None of them pointed upwards. Their life had failed and turned aside just when it should have become triumphant. The character of a tree reveals itself chiefly at the extremities, and it was precisely here that they all drooped and achieved this hint of goblin distortion in the growth, that is, of the last few years. What ought to have been fairy, joyful, natural, was instead uncomely to the verge of the grotesque. Spontaneous expression was arrested. My mind perceived a goblin garden and was caught in it. The place grimaced at me. With the flowers it was similar, though far more difficult to detect in detail for description. I saw the smaller vegetable growth as impish, half malicious. Even the terraces sloped ill, as though their ends had sagged since they had been so lavishly constructed. Their varying angles gave a queerly bewildering aspect to their sequence that was unpleasant to the eye. One might wander among their deceptive lengths and get lost among open terraces, with the house quite close at hand. Unhomely seemed the entire garden, unable to give repose, restlessness in it everywhere, almost strife and discord certainly. Moreover, the garden grew into the house into the garden, and in both was this idea of resistance to the natural, the spirit that says no to joy. All over it I was aware of the effort to achieve another end, the struggle to burst forth and escape into free, spontaneous expression that should be happy and natural. Yet the effort forever frustrated by the weight of this dark shadow that rendered it abortive. Life crawled aside into a channel that was a cul-de-sac, then turned horribly upon itself. Instead of blossom and fruit, there were weeds. This approach of life I was conscious of then dismal failure. There was no fulfillment, nothing happened. And so, through this singular mood, I came a little nearer to understand the unpure thing that had stammered out into expression through my sister's talent. For the unpure is merely negative. It has no existence. It is but the cramped expression of what is true, stammering its way brokenly over false boundaries that seek to limit and confine. Great, full expression of anything is pure, whereas here was only the incomplete, unfinished, and therefore ugly. There was a strife and pain and desire to escape. I found myself shrinking from house and grounds as one shrinks from the touch of the mentally arrested, those in whom life has turned awry. There was almost mutilation in it. Past items, too, now flocked to confirm this feeling that I walked, liberty captured and half-maimed, in a monstrous garden. I remembered days of rain that refreshed the countryside, but left these grounds, cracked with the summer heat, unsatisfied and thirsty. And how the big winds that cleaned the woods and fields elsewhere crawled here with difficulty through the dense foliage that protected the towers from the north and west and east. They were ineffective, sluggish currents. There was no real wind. Nothing happened. I began to realize far more clearly than in my sister's fanciful explanation about layers that here were many contrary influences at work, mutually destructive of one another. House and grounds were not haunted merely. They were the arena of past thinking and feeling, perhaps of terrible, impure beliefs, each striving to suppress the others, yet no one of them achieving supremacy because no one of them was strong enough, no one of them was true. Each, moreover, tried to win me over, though only one was able to reach my mind at all. For some obscure reason possibly, because my temperament had a natural bias towards the grotesque, it was the goblin layer. With me, it was the line of least resistance. In my own thoughts, this goblin garden revealed, of course, merely my personal interpretation. I felt now objectively what long ago my mind had felt subjectively. My work, essential sign of spontaneous life with me, had stopped dead. Production had become impossible. I stood now considerably closer to the cause of this sterility. The cause, rather, turned bolder, had stepped insolently nearer. Nothing happened anywhere. House, garden, mind alike were barren, abortive, torn by the strife of frustrate impulse, ugly, hateful, sinful. Yet behind it, all was still the desire of life desire to escape accomplish. Hopen, intolerable hopi, became startlingly aware-crowned torture. And realizing this, though in some part of me where reason lost her hold, there rose upon me then another and a darker thing that caught me by the throat and made me shrink with a sense of revulsion that touched actual loathing. I knew instantly whence it came, this wave of abhorrence and disgust, for even while I saw red and felt revolt rise in me, it seemed that I grew partially aware of the layer next below the goblin. I perceived the existence of this deeper stratum. One opened the way for the other, as it were. There were so many, yet all interrelated. To admit one was to clear the way for all. If I lingered, I should be caught horribly. They struggled with such violence for supremacy among themselves, however, that this latest uprising was instantly smothered and crushed back, though not before a glimpse had been revealed to me, and the redness in my thoughts transferred itself to color my surroundings thickly and appallingly with blood. This lurid aspect drenched the garden, smeared the terraces, lent to the very soil a tinge as of sacrificial rites that choked the breath in me, while it seemed to fix me to the earth my feet so longed to leave. It was so revolting that at the same time I felt a dreadful curiosity as of fascination I wished to stay. Between these contrary impulses, I think I actually reeled a moment, transfixed by a fascination of the awful. Through the lighter goblin veil, I felt myself sinking down, down, down into this turgid layer that was so much more violent and so much more ancient. The upper layer, indeed, seemed fairy by comparison with this terror born of the lust for blood, thick with the anguish of human sacrificial victims. Upper, then I was already sinking, my feet were caught, I was actually in it. What atavistic strain, hidden deep within me, had been touched into vile response, giving this flash of intuitive comprehension, I cannot say. The coatings laid on by civilization are probably thin enough in all of us. I made a supreme effort. The sun and wind came back. I could almost swear I opened my eyes. Something very atrocious surged back into the depths, carrying with it a thought of tangled woods, of big stones standing in a circle, motionless, white figures, the one form bound with ropes, and the ghastly gleam of the knife. Like smoke upon a battlefield, it rolled away. I was standing on the gravel path below the second terrace when the familiar goblin garden danced back again, doubly grotesque now, doubly mocking, yet, by way of contrast, almost welcome. My glimpse into the depths was momentary, it seems, and had passed utterly away. The common world rushed back with a sense of glad relief, yet ominous now forever, I felt, for the knowledge of what its past had built upon. In street, in theater, in the festivities of friends, in music room or playing field, even indeed in church, how could the memory of what I had seen and felt leave its hideous trace? The very structure of my thought, it seemed to me, was stained. What has been thought by others can never be obliterated until. With a start, my reverie broke and fled, scattered by a violent sound that I recognized for the first time in my life as wholly desirable. The returning motor meant that my hostess was back. Yet so urgent had been my temporary obsession that my first presentation of her was, well, not as I knew her now. Floating along with a face of anguished torture, I saw Mabel, a mere effigy captured by others' thinking, pass down into those depths of fire and blood that only just had closed beneath my feet. She dipped away. She vanished, her fading eyes turned to the last towards some savior who had failed her. And that strange, intolerable hope was in her face. The mystery of the place was pretty thick about me just then. It was the fall of dusk, and the ghost of slanting sunshine was as unreal as though badly painted. The garden stood at attention all about me. I cannot explain it, but I can tell it, I think, exactly as it happened, for it remains vivid in me forever that, for the first time, something almost happened, myself apparently the combining link through which it pressed towards delivery. I had already turned towards the house. In my mind were pictures, not actual thoughts, of the motor, tea on the veranda, my sister, Mabel when there came behind me this tumultuous, awful rush as I left the garden. The ugliness, the pain, the striving to escape, the whole negative and suppressed agony that was the place, focused that second into a concentrated effort to produce a result. It was a blinding tempest of long frustrate desire that heaved at me, surging appallingly behind me like an anguished mob. I was in the act of crossing the frontier into my normal self again, when it came, catching fearfully at my skirts. I might use an entire dictionary of descriptive adjectives, yet come no nearer to it than this: the conception of a huge assemblage determined to escape with me, or to snatch me back among themselves. My legs trembled for an instant, and I caught my breath, then turned and ran as fast as possible up the ugly terraces. At the same instant, as though the clanging of an iron gate cut short the unfinished phrase, I thought the beginning of an awful thing. The damned! Like this, it rushed after me from that goblin garden that had sought to keep me. The damned! For there was sound in it. I know full well it was subjective, not actually heard at all, yet somehow sound was in it a great volume, roaring and booming thunderously, far away and below me. The sentence dipped back into the depths that gave it birth, unfinished. Its completion was prevented. As usual, nothing happened. But it drove behind me like a hurricane as I ran towards the house, and the sound of it I can only liken to those terrible undertones you may hear standing beside Niagara. They lie behind the mere crash of the falling flood, within it somehow, not audible to all, felt rather than definitely heard. It seemed to echo back from the surface of those sagging terraces as I flew across their sloping ends, for it was somehow underneath them. It was in the rustle of the wind that stirred the skirts of the drooping Wellingtonias. The beds of formal flowers passed it on to the creepers, red as blood, that crept over the unsightly building. Into the structure of the vulgar and forbidding house it sank away, the towers took it home. The uncomely doors and windows seemed almost like mouths that had uttered the words themselves. And on the upper floors at that very moment, I saw two maids in the act of closing them again. And on the veranda, as I arrived breathless and shaken in my soul, Frances and Mabel, standing by the tea table, looked up to greet me. In the faces of both were clearly legible the signs of shock. They watched me coming, yet so full of their own distress that they hardly noticed the state in which I came. In the face of my hostess, however, I read another and a bigger thing than in the face of Frances. Mabel knew. She had experienced what I had experienced. She had heard that awful sentence I had heard, but heard it not for the first time, heard it, moreover, I verily believe, complete and to its dreadful end. "Bill, did you hear that curious noise just now?" Frances asked it sharply before I could say a word. Her manner was confused, she looked straight at me, and there was a tremor in her voice she could not hide. "There's wind about," I said, "wind in the trees and sweeping round the walls. It's risen rather suddenly." My voice faltered rather. "No, it wasn't wind," she insisted, with a significance meant for me alone, but badly hidden. "It was more like distant thunder, we thought. How you ran, too," she added. "What a pace you came across the terraces." I knew instantly from the way she said it that they both had already heard the sound before and were anxious to know if I had heard it, and how. My interpretation was what they sought. It was a curiously deep sound, I admit. It may have been big guns at sea, I suggested, forts or cruisers practicing. The coast isn't so very far and with the wind in the right direction. The expression on Mabel's face stopped me dead. "Like huge doors closing," she said softly in her colorless voice, "enormous metal doors shutting against a mass of people clamoring to get out." The gravity, the note of hopelessness in her tones, was shocking. Frances had gone into the house the instant Mabel began to speak. "I'm cold," she had said. "I think I'll get a shawl." Mabel and I were alone. I believe it was the first time we had been really alone since I arrived. She looked up from the teacups, fixing her pallid eyes on mine. She had made a question of the sentence. "You hear it like that?" I asked innocently. I purposely used the present tense. She changed her stare from one eye to the other. It was absolutely expressionless. My sister's step sounded on the floor of the room behind us. "If only," Mabel began, then stopped, and my own feelings leaping out instinctively completed the sentence I felt was in her mind. "Something would happen." She instantly corrected me. I had caught her thought, yet somehow phrased it wrongly. "We could escape," she lowered her tone a little, saying it hurriedly. The "we" amazed and horrified me, but something in her voice and manner struck me utterly dumb. There was ice and terror in it. It was a dying woman speaking a lost and hopeless soul. In that atrocious moment, I hardly noticed what was said exactly, but I remember that my sister returned with a gray shawl about her shoulders, and that Mabel said, in her ordinary voice again, "It is chilly, yes. Let's have tea inside." And that two maids, one of them the grenadier, speedily carried the loaded trays into the morning room and put a match to the logs in the great open fireplace. It was, after all, foolish to risk the sharp evening air, for dusk was falling steadily, and even the sunshine of the day just fading could not turn autumn into summer. I was the last to come in. Just as I left the veranda, a large black bird swooped down in front of me past the pillars. It dropped from overhead, swerved abruptly to one side as it caught sight of me, and flapped heavily towards the shrubberies on the left of the terraces, where it disappeared into the gloom. It flew very low, very close. And it startled me, I think because in some way it seemed like my shadow materialized as though the dark horror that was rising everywhere from house and garden, then settling back so thickly yet so imperceptibly upon us all, were incarnated in that whirring creature that passed between the daylight and the coming night. I stood a moment, wondering if it would appear again, before I followed the others indoors, and as I was in the act of closing the windows after me, I caught a glimpse of a figure on the lawn. It was some distance away, on the other side of the shrubberies, in fact where the bird had vanished. But in spite of the twilight that half magnified, half obscured it, the identity was unmistakable. I knew the housekeeper's stiff walk too well to be deceived. "Mrs. Marsh taking the air," I said to myself. I felt the necessity of saying it, and I wondered why she was doing so at this particular hour. If I had other thoughts, they were so vague, and so quickly and utterly suppressed, that I cannot recall them sufficiently to relate them here. And once indoors, it was to be expected that there would come explanation, discussion, conversation, at any rate, regarding the singular noise and its cause, some uttered evidence of the mood that had been strong enough to drive us all inside. Yet there was none. Each of us purposely, and with various skill, ignored it. We talked little, and when we did it was of anything in the world but that. Personally, I experienced a touch of that same bewilderment which had come over me during my first talk with Francis on the evening of my arrival, for I recall now the acute tension, and the hope, yet dread, that one or other of us must sooner or later introduce the subject. It did not happen, however. No reference was made to it even remotely. It was the presence of Mabel, I felt positive, that prohibited. As soon might we have discussed death in the bedroom of a dying woman. The only scrap of conversation I remember, where all was ordinary and commonplace, was when Mabel spoke casually to the grenadier asking why Mrs. Marsh had omitted to do something or other what it was I forget, and that the maid replied respectfully that Mrs. Marsh was very sorry, but her, and still pained her. I inquired, though so casually that I scarcely know what prompted the words, whether she had injured herself severely, and the reply, she upset a lamp and burnt herself, was said in a tone that made me feel my curiosity was indiscreet. But she always has an excuse for not doing things she ought to do. The little bit of conversation remained with me, and I remember particularly the quick way Frances interrupted and turned the talk upon the delinquencies of servants in general, telling incidents of her own at our flat with a volubility that perhaps seemed forced, and that certainly did not encourage general talk as it may have been intended to do. We lapsed into silence immediately she finished. But for all our care and all our calculated silence, each knew that something had, in these last moments, come very close. It had brushed us in passing, it had retired, and I am inclined to think now that the large dark thing I saw, riding the dusk, probably bird of prey, was in some sense a symbol of it in my mind that, actually there had been no bird at all, I mean, but that my mood of apprehension and dismay had formed the vivid picture in my thoughts. It had swept past us, it had retreated, but it was now, at this moment, in hiding very close, and it was watching us. Perhaps, too, it was mere coincidence that I encountered Mrs. Marsh, his housekeeper, several times that evening in the short interval between tea and dinner, and that on each occasion the sight of this gaunt, half-saturnine woman fed my prejudice against her. Once, on my way to the telephone, I ran into her just where the passage is somewhat jammed by a square table carrying the Chinese gong, a grandfather's clock, and a box of croquet mallets. We both gave way, then both advanced, then again gave way simultaneously. It seemed impossible to pass. We stepped with decision to the same side, finally colliding in the middle, while saying those futile little things, half apology, half excuse, that are inevitable at such times. In the end, she stood upright against the wall for me to pass, taking her place against the very door I wished to open. It was ludicrous. "Excuse me, I was just going into telephone," I explained, and she sidled off, murmuring apologies, but opening the door for me while she did so. Our hands met a moment on the handle. There was a second's awkwardness. It was too stupid. I remembered her injury, and by way of something to say, I inquired after it. She thanked me. It was entirely healed now, but it might have been much worse, and there was something about the mercy of the Lord that I didn't quite catch. While telephoning, however London call, and my attention focused on it, realized sharply that this was the first time I had spoken with her. Also, that I had touched her. It happened to be a Sunday, and the lines were clear. I got my connection quickly, and the incident was forgotten while my thoughts went up to London. On my way upstairs, then, the woman came back into my mind, so that I recalled other things about her, how she seemed all over the house, in unlikely places often, how I had caught her sitting in the hall alone that night, how she was forever coming and going with her lugubrious visage, and that untidy hair at the back that had made me laugh 3 years ago with the idea that it looked singed or burnt, and how the impression on my first arrival at the Towers was that this woman somehow kept alive, though its evidence was outwardly suppressed, the influence of her late employer and of his somber teachings. Somewhere with her was associated the idea of punishment, vindictiveness, revenge. I remembered again, suddenly, my odd notion that she sought to keep her present mistress here, a prisoner in this bleak and comfortless house, and that really, in spite of her obsequious silence, she was intensely opposed to the change of thought that had reclaimed Mabel to a happier view of life. All this in a passing second flashed in review before me, and I discovered, or at any rate reconstructed, the real Mrs. Marsh. She was decidedly in the shadow. More, she stood in the forefront of it, stealthily leading an assault, as it were, against the towers and its occupants, as though, consciously or unconsciously, she labored incessantly to this hateful end. I can only judge that some state of nervousness in me permitted the series of insignificant thoughts to assume this dramatic shape, and that what had gone before prepared the way and led her up at the head of so formidable a procession. I relate it exactly as it came to me. My nerves were doubtless somewhat on edge by now. Otherwise, I should hardly have been a prey to the exaggeration at all. I seemed open to so many strange impressions. Nothing else, perhaps, can explain my ridiculous conversation with her. When, for the third time that evening, I came suddenly upon the woman halfway down the stairs, standing by an open window as if in the act of listening. She was dressed in black, a black shawl over her square shoulders and black gloves on her big, broad hands. 2 black objects, prayer books apparently, she clasped, and on her head she wore a bonnet with shaking beads of jet. At first I did not know her, as I came running down upon her from the landing. It was only when she stood aside to let me pass that I saw her profile against the tapestry and recognized Mrs. Marsh. And to catch her on the front stairs, dressed like this, struck me as incongruous impertinent. I paused in my dangerous descent. Through the opened window came the sound of bells, church bells, a sound more depressing to me than superstition, and as nauseating. Though the action was ill-judged, I obeyed the sudden prompting. Was it a secret desire to attack, perhaps? And spoke to her. "Been to church, I suppose, Mrs. Marsh?" I said. "Or just going, perhaps?" Her face, as she looked up a second to reply, was like an iron doll that moved its lips and turned its eyes, but made no other imitation of life at all. "Some of us still goes, sir," she said unctuously. It was respectful enough, yet the implied judgment of the rest of the world made me almost angry. A deferential insolence lay behind the affected meekness. "For those who believe, no doubt it is helpful," I smiled. "True religion brings peace and happiness, I'm sure, joy, Mrs. Marsh, joy." I found keen satisfaction in the emphasis. She looked at me like a knife. I cannot describe the implacable thing that shone in her fixed, stern eyes, nor the shadow of felt darkness that stole across her face. She glittered. I felt hate in her. I knew she knew too who was in the thoughts of us both at that moment. She replied softly, never forgetting her place for an instant. "There is joy, sir, and even over one sinner that repenteth, and in church there goes up prayer to God for those well, for the others, sir, She cut short her sentence thus. The gloom about her as she said it was like the gloom about a hearse, a tomb, a darkness of great hopeless dungeons. My tongue ran on of itself with a kind of bitter satisfaction. "We must believe there are no others, Mrs. Marsh. Salvation, you know, would be such a failure if there were. No merciful, all-foreseeing God could ever have devised such a fearful plan." Her voice, interrupting me, seemed to rise out of the bowels of the earth. "They rejected the salvation, when it was offered to them, sir, on earth. But you wouldn't have them tortured forever because of one mistake in ignorance," I said, fixing her with my eye. "Come now, would you, Mrs. Marsh? No God worth worshipping could permit such cruelty. Think a moment what it means." She stared at me, a curious expression in her stupid eyes. It seemed to me as though the woman in her revolted, while yet she dared not suffer her grim belief to trip. That is, she would willingly have had it otherwise, but for a terror that prevented. "We may pray for them, sir, and we may ope." She dropped her eyes to the carpet. "Good, good," I put in cheerfully, sorry now that I had spoken at all. "That's more hopeful, at any rate, isn't it?" She murmured something about Abraham's bosom and the time of salvation not being forever, as I tried to pass her. Then a half gesture that she made stopped me. There was something more she wished to say to ask. She looked up furtively. In her eyes I saw the woman peering out through fear. "Perhaps, sir," she faltered, as though lightning must strike her dead. "Perhaps, would you think, a drop of cold water given in his name might moisten." But I stopped her, for the foolish talk had lasted long enough. "Of course," I exclaimed, "of course. For God is love, remember, and love means charity, tolerance, sympathy, and sparing others pain." And I hurried past her, determined to end the outrageous conversation for which yet I knew myself entirely to blame. Behind me she stood stock still for several minutes, half bewildered, half alarmed, as I suspected. I caught the fragment of another sentence, one word of it, rather punishment, but the rest escaped me. Her arrogance and condescending tolerance exasperated me, while I was at the same time secretly pleased that I might have touched some string of remorse or sympathy in her after all. Her belief was iron. She dared not let it go. Yet somewhere underneath, there lurked the germ of a wholesome revulsion. She would help them if she dared. Her question proved it. Half ashamed of myself, I turned and crossed the hall quickly lest I should be tempted to say more, and in me was a disagreeable sensation as though I had just left the incurable ward of some great hospital. A reaction caught me as of nausea. Ugh! I wanted such people cleansed by fire. They seemed to me as centers of contamination, whose vicious thoughts flowed out to stain God's glorious world. I saw myself, Francis, Mabel too especially, on the rack, while that odious figure of cruelty and darkness stood over us, and ordered the awful handles turned in order that we might be saved, forced, that is, to think and believe exactly as she thought and believed. I found relief for my somewhat childish indignation by letting myself loose upon the organ then. The flood of Bach and Beethoven brought back the sense of proportion. It proved, however, at the same time that there had been this growth of distortion in me, and that it had been provided apparently by my closer contact for the first time with that funereal personality, the woman who, like her master, believed that all holding views of God that differed from her own must be damned eternally. It gave me, moreover, some faint clue perhaps, though a clue I was unequal of following up, to the nature of the strife and terror and frustrate influence in the house. That housekeeper had to do with it. She kept it alive. Her thought was like a spell she waved above her mistress's head. Chapter V. That night I was wakened by a hurried tapping at my door, and before I could answer, Frances stood beside my bed. She had switched on the light as she came in. Her hair fell straggling over her dressing gown. Her face was deathly pale, its expression so distraught it was almost haggard. The eyes were very wide. She looked almost like another woman. She was whispering at a great pace, "Bill, Bill, wake up, quick." "I am awake, what is it?" I whispered too. I was startled. "Listen," was all she said. Her eyes stared into vacancy. There was not a sound in the great house. The wind had dropped, and all was still. Only the tapping seemed to continue endlessly in my brain. The clock on the mantelpiece pointed to 2:30. "I heard nothing, Francis. What is it?" I rubbed my eyes. I had been very deeply asleep. "Listen," she repeated very softly, holding up one finger and turning her eyes towards the door she had left ajar. Her usual calmness had deserted her. She was in the grip of some distressing terror. For a full minute we held our breath and listened. Then her eyes rolled round again and met my own, and her skin went even whiter than before. "It woke me," she said beneath her breath, and moving a step nearer to my bed. "It was the noise." Even her whisper trembled. The noise, the word repeated itself dully of its own accord. I would rather it had been anything in the world but that earthquake, foreign cannon, collapse of the house above our heads. "The noise, Francis, are you sure?" I was playing really for a little time. "It was like thunder. At first I thought it was thunder, but a minute later it came again from underground. It's appalling." She muttered the words, her voice not properly under control. There was a pause of perhaps a minute, and then we both spoke at once. We said foolish, obvious things that neither of us believed in for a second. The roof had fallen in, there were burglars downstairs, the safes had been blown open. It was to comfort each other as children do that we said these things. Also, it was to gain further time. "There's someone in the house, of course," I heard my voice say finally, as I sprang out of bed and hurried into dressing gown and slippers. "Don't be alarmed. I'll go down and see." And from the drawer I took a pistol it was my habit to carry everywhere with me. I loaded it carefully while Frances stood stock-still beside the bed and watched. I moved towards the open door. "You stay here, Francis," I whispered, the beating of my heart making the words uneven, "while I go down and make a search. Lock yourself in, girl. Nothing can happen to you. It was downstairs, you said." "Underneath," she answered faintly, pointing through the floor. She moved suddenly between me and the door. "Listen, hark," she said, the eyes in her face quite fixed. "It's coming again," and she turned her head to catch the slightest sound. I stood there watching her, and while I watched her, shook. But nothing stirred. From the halls below rose only the whir and quiet ticking of the numerous clocks. The blind by the open window behind us flapped out a little into the room as the draft caught it. "I'll come with you, Bill, to the next floor," she broke the silence. "Then I'll stay with Mabel till you come up again." The blind sank down with a long sigh as she said it. The question jumped to my lips before I could repress it. "Mabel is awake, she heard it too." I hardly know why horror caught me at her answer. All was so vague and terrible as we stood there playing the great game of this sinister house where nothing ever happened. We met in the passage. She was on her way to me. What shook in me shook inwardly. Francis, did not see it. I had the feeling just that the noise was upon us, that any second it would boom and roar about our ears. But the deep silence held. I only heard my sister's little whisper coming across the room in answer to my question. "Then what is Mabel doing now?" And her reply proved that she was yielding at last beneath the dreadful tension, for she spoke at once, unable longer to keep up the pretense. With a kind of relief, as it were, she said it out, looking helplessly at me like a child. "She is weeping and nah." My expression must have stopped her. I believe I clapped both hands upon her mouth, though when I realized things clearly again, I found they were covering my own ears instead. It was a moment of unutterable horror. The revulsion I felt was actually physical. It would have given me pleasure to fire off all the 5 chambers of my pistol into the air above my head. The sound, a definite, wholesome sound that explained itself, would have been a positive relief. Other feelings, though, were in me too, all over me, rushing to and fro. It was vain to seek their disentanglement. It was impossible. I confess that I experienced, among them, a touch of paralyzing fear, though for a moment only. It passed as sharply as it came, leaving me with a violent flush of blood to the face such as bursts of anger bring, followed abruptly by an icy perspiration over the entire body. Yet I may honestly avow that it was not ordinary personal fear I felt, nor any common dread of physical injury. It was, rather, a vast, impersonal shrinking, a sympathetic shrinking from the agony and terror that countless others, somewhere, somehow, felt for themselves. The first sensation of a prison overwhelmed me in that instant, of bitter strife and frenzied suffering, and the fiery torture of the yearning to escape that was yet hopelessly uttered. It was of incredible power. It was real. The vain, intolerable hope swept over me. I mastered myself, though hardly knowing how, and took my sister's hand. It was as cold as ice, as I led her firmly to the door and out into the passage. Apparently she noticed nothing of my so near collapse, for I caught her whisper as we went. "You are brave, Bill, splendidly brave." The upper corridors of the great sleeping house were brightly lit. On her way to me, she had turned on every electric switch her hand could reach. And as we passed the final flight of stairs to the floor below, I heard a door shut softly and knew that Mabel had been listening, waiting for us. I led my sister up to it. She knocked, and the door was opened cautiously an inch or so. The room was pitch black. I caught no glimpse of Mabel standing there. Francis turned to me with a hurried whisper, "Billy, you will be careful, won't you?" and went in. I just had time to answer that I would not be long, and Francis to reply, "You'll find us here," when the door closed and cut her sentence short before its end. But it was not alone the closing door that took the final words. Francis, by the way she disappeared, I knew it had made a swift and violent movement into the darkness that was as though she sprang. She leaped upon that other woman who stood back among the shadows, for, simultaneously with the clipping of the sentence, another sound was also stop-stifled, smothered, choked back lest I should also hear it. Yet not in time. I heard it, a hard and horrible sound that explained both the leap and the abrupt cessation of the whispered words. I stood irresolute a moment. It was as though all the bones had been withdrawn from my body, so that I must sink and fall. That sound plucked them out, and plucked out my self-possession with them. I am not sure that it was a sound I had ever heard before, though children, I half remembered, made it sometimes in blind rages when they knew not what they did. In a grown-up person, certainly, I had never known it. I associated it with animals rather horribly. In the history of the world, no doubt, it has been common enough, alas, but fortunately today there can be but few who know it, or would recognize it even when heard. The bones shot back into my body the same instant, but red-hot and burning. The brief instant of irresolution passed. I was torn between the desire to break down the door and enter, and to run for my life from a thing I dared not face. Out of the horrid tumult, then, I adopted neither course. Without reflection, certainly without analysis of what was best to do for my sister, myself, or Mabel, I took up my action where it had been interrupted. I turned from the awful door and moved slowly towards the head of the stairs. But that dreadful little sound came with me. I believe my own teeth chattered. It seemed all over the house, in the empty halls that opened into the long passages towards the music room, and even in the grounds outside the building. From the lawns and barren garden, from the ugly terraces themselves, it rose into the night, and behind it came a curious driving sound. Incomplete, unfinished, as of wailing for deliverance, the wailing of desperate souls in anguish, the dull and dry beseeching of hopeless spirits in prison. That I could have taken the little sound from the bedroom where I actually heard it, and spread it thus over the entire house and grounds, is evidence, perhaps, of the state my nerves were in. The wailing assuredly was in my mind alone, but the longer I hesitated, the more difficult became my task, and, gathering up my dressing gown, lest I should trip in the darkness, I passed slowly down the staircase into the hall below. I carried neither candle nor matches. Every switch in room and corridor was known to me. The covering of darkness was indeed rather comforting than otherwise, for if it prevented seeing, it also prevented being seen. The heavy pistol, knocking against my thigh as I moved, made me feel I was carrying a child's toy, foolishly. I experienced in every nerve that primitive vast dread which is the thrill of darkness. Merely the child in me was comforted by that pistol. The night was not entirely black. The iron bars across the glass front door were visible, and, equally, I discerned the big, stiff wooden chairs in the hall, the gaping fireplace, the upright pillars supporting the staircase, the round table in the center with its books and flower vases, and the basket that held visitors' cards. There, too, was the stick and umbrella stand, and the shelf with railway guides, directory, and telegraph forms. Clocks ticked everywhere with sounds like quiet footfalls. Light fell here and there in patches from the floor above. I stood a moment in the hall, letting my eyes grow more accustomed to the gloom, while deciding on a plan of search. I made out the ivy trailing outside over one of the big windows, and then the tall clock by the front door made a grating noise deep down inside its body. It was the presentation clock, large and hideous, given by the congregation of his church, and, dreading the booming strike it seemed to threaten, I made a quick decision. If others beside myself were about in the night, the sound of that striking might cover their approach. So I tiptoed to the right, where the passage led towards the dining room. In the other direction were the morning and drawing rooms, both little used, and various other rooms beyond that had been his, generally now kept locked. I thought of my sister, waiting upstairs with that frightened woman for my return. I went quickly, yet stealthily. And to my surprise, the door of the dining room was open. It had been opened. I paused on the threshold, staring about me. I think I fully expected to see a figure blocked in the shadows against the heavy sideboard or looming on the other side beneath his portrait. But the room was empty. I felt it empty. Through the wide bow windows that gave onto the veranda came an uncertain glimmer that even shone reflected in the polished surface of the dinner table. And again, I perceived the stiff outline of chairs, waiting tenantless all round it, two larger ones with high carved backs at either end. The monkey trees on the upper terrace, too, were visible outside against the sky, and the solemn crests of the Wellingtonias on the terraces below. The enormous clock on the mantelpiece ticked very slowly, as though its machinery were running down, and I made out the pale round patch that was its face. Resisting my first inclination to turn the lights up, my hand had gone so far as to finger the friendly knob. I crossed the room so carefully that no single board creaked, nor a single chair, as I rested a hand upon its back, moved on the parquet flooring. I turned neither to the right nor left, nor did I once look back. I went towards the long corridor filled with priceless objets d'art that led through various antechambers into the spacious music room, and only at the mouth of this corridor did I next halt a moment in uncertainty. For this long corridor, lit faintly by high windows on the left from the veranda, was very narrow, owing to the massive shelves and fancy tables it contained. It was not that I feared to knock over precious things as I went, but that, because of its ungenerous width, There would be no room to pass another person if I met one. And the certainty had suddenly come upon me that somewhere in this corridor another person at this actual moment stood. Here, somehow, amid all this dead atmosphere of furniture and impersonal emptiness, lay the hint of a living human presence. And with such conviction did it come upon me that my hand instinctively gripped the pistol in my pocket before I could even think. Either someone had passed along this corridor just before me, or someone lay waiting at its farther end, withdrawn or flattened into one of the little recesses to let me pass. It was the person who had opened the door, and the blood ran from my heart as I realized it. It was not courage that sent me on, but rather a strong impulsion from behind that made it impossible to retreat. The feeling that a throng pressed at my back, drawing nearer and nearer, that I was already half surrounded, swept, dragged, coaxed into a vast prison house where there was wailing and gnashing of teeth, where their worm dieth not and their fire is not quenched. I can neither explain nor justify the storm of irrational emotion that swept me as I stood in that moment, staring down the length of the silent corridor towards the music room at the far end. I can only repeat that no personal bravery sent me down it, but that the negative emotion of fear was swamped in this vast sea of pity and commiseration for others that surged upon me. My senses, at least, were no whit confused. If anything, my brain registered impressions with keener accuracy than usual. I noticed, for instance, that the two swinging doors of bays that cut the corridor into definite lengths, making little rooms of the spaces between them, were both wide open in the dim light, no mean achievement. Also that the fronds of a palm plant, some 10 feet in front of me, still stirred gently from the air of someone who had recently gone past them. The long green leaves waved to and fro like hands. Then I went stealthily forward down the narrow space, proud even that I had this command of myself, and so carefully that my feet made no sound upon the Japanese matting on the floor. It was a journey that seemed timeless. I have no idea how fast or slow I went, but I remember that I deliberately examined articles on each side of me, peering with particular closeness into the recesses of wall and window. I passed the first baize doors, and the passage beyond them widened out to hold shelves of books. There were sofas and small reading tables against the wall. It narrowed again presently as I entered the second stretch. The windows here were higher and smaller, and marble statuettes of classical subject lined the walls, watching me like figures of the dead. Their white and shining faces saw me, yet made no sign. I passed next between the second baize doors. They, too, had been fastened back with hooks against the wall. Thus all doors were open had been recently opened. And so, at length, I found myself in the final widening of the corridor, which formed an antechamber to the music room itself. It had been used formerly to hold the overflow of meetings. No door separated it from the great hall beyond, but heavy curtains hung usually to close it off, and these curtains were invariably drawn. They now stood wide, and here I can merely state the impression that came upon me. I knew myself at last surrounded. The throng that pressed behind me also surged in front. Facing me in the big room and waiting for my entry stood a multitude. On either side of me, in the very air above my head, the vast assemblage paused upon my coming. The pause, however, was momentary, for instantly the deep, tumultuous movement was resumed that yet was silent as a cavern underground. I felt the agony that was in it, the passionate striving, the awful struggle to escape. The semi-darkness held beseeching faces that fought to press themselves upon my vision, yearning yet hopeless eyes, lips scorched and dry, mouths that opened to implore but found no craved delivery in actual words, and a fury of misery and hate that made the life in me stop dead, frozen by the horror of vain pity. That intolerable, vain hope was everywhere. And the multitude, it came to me, was not a single multitude, but many, for, as soon as one huge division pressed too close upon the edge of escape, it was dragged back by another and prevented. The wild host was divided against itself. Here dwelt the shadow I had imagined weeks ago, and in it struggled armies of lost souls as in the depths of some bottomless pit whence there is no escape. The layers mingled, fighting against themselves in endless torture. It was in this great shadow I had clairvoyantly seen Mabel, but about its fearful mouth, I now was certain, hovered another figure of darkness, a figure who sought to keep it in existence, since to her thought were due those lampless depths of woe without escape. Towards me the multitudes now surged. It was a sound and a movement that brought me back into myself. The great dock at the farther end of the room just then struck the hour of 3. That was the sound. And the movement? I was aware that a figure was passing across the distant center of the floor. Instantly, I dropped back into the arena of my little human terror. My hand again clutched stupidly at the pistol butt. I drew back into the folds of the heavy curtain, and the figure advanced. I remember every detail. At first it seemed to me enormous, this advancing shadow far beyond human scale, but as it came nearer, I measured it, though not consciously, by the organ pipes that gleamed in faint colors just above its gradual soft approach. It passed them, already halfway across the great room. I saw then that its stature was that of ordinary men. The prolonged booming of the clock died away. I heard the footfall, shuffling upon the polished boards. I heard another sound of voice, low and monotonous, droning as in prayer. The figure was speaking. It was a woman, and she carried in both hands before her a small object that faintly shimmered, a glass of water. And then I recognized her. There was still an instant's time before she reached me, and I made use of it. I shrank back, flattening myself against the wall. Her voice ceased a moment, as she turned and carefully drew the curtains together behind her, dosing them with one hand. Oblivious of my presence, though she actually touched my dressing gown with the hand that pulled the cords, she resumed her dreadful, solemn march, disappearing at length down the long vista of the corridor like a shadow. But as she passed me, her voice began again, so that I heard each word distinctly as she uttered it, her head aloft, her figure upright, as though she moved at the head of a procession. A drop of cold water, given in his name, shall moisten their burning tongues. It was repeated monotonously over and over again, droning down into the distance as she went, until at length both voice and figure faded into the shadows at the farther end. For a time, I have no means of measuring precisely. I stood in that dark corner, pressing my back against the wall, and would have drawn the curtains down to hide me had I dared to stretch an arm out. The dread that presently the woman would return passed gradually away. I realized that the air had emptied, the crowd her presence had stirred into activity had retreated. I was alone in the gloomy underspace of the odious building. Then I remembered suddenly again the terrified women waiting for me on that upper landing, and realized that my skin was wet and freezing cold after a profuse perspiration. I prepared to retrace my steps. I remember the effort it cost me to leave the support of the wall and covering darkness of my corner, and step out into the gray light of the corridor. At first I sidled, then, finding this mode of walking impossible, turned my face boldly and walked quickly, regardless that my dressing gown set the precious objects shaking as I passed. A wind that sighed mournfully against the high, small windows seemed to have got inside the corridor as well. It felt so cold, and every moment I dreaded to see the outline of the woman's figure as she waited in recess or angle against the wall for me to pass. Was there another thing I dreaded even more? I cannot say. I only know that the first baize doors had swung to behind me, and the second ones were close at hand, when the great dim thunder caught me, pouring up with prodigious volume so that it seemed to roll out from another world. It shook the very bowels of the building. I was closer to it than that other time, when it had followed me from the Goblin Garden. There was strength and hardness in it, as of metal reverberation. Some touch of numbness, almost of paralysis, must surely have been upon me that I felt no actual terror, for I remember even turning and standing still to hear it better. That is the noise, my thought ran stupidly, and I think I whispered it aloud. The doors are closing. The wind outside against the windows was audible, so it cannot have been really loud. Yet to me, it was the biggest, deepest sound I have ever heard, but so far away, with such awful remoteness in it, that I had to doubt my own ears at the same time. It seemed underground, the rumbling of earthquake gates that shut remorselessly within the rocky earth stupendous ultimate thunder. They were shut off from help again. The doors had closed. I felt a storm of pity, an agony of bitter, futile hate sweep through me. My memory of the figure changed then. The woman with the glass of cooling water had stepped down from heaven, but the man, or was it men, who smeared this terrible layer of belief and thought upon the world. I crossed the dining room. It was fancy, of course. that held my eyes from glancing at the portrait for fear I should see its smiling approval, and so finally reached the hall, where the light from the floor above seemed now quite bright in comparison. All the doors I closed carefully behind me, but first I had to open them. The woman had closed every one. Up the stairs, then, I actually ran, 2 steps at a time. My sister was standing outside Mabel's door. By her face I knew that she had also heard. There was no need to ask. I quickly made my mind up. "There's nothing," I said, and detailed briefly my tour of search. "All is quiet and undisturbed downstairs. May God forgive me." She beckoned to me, closing the door softly behind her. My heart beat violently a moment, then stood still. "Mabel," she said aloud. It was like the sentence of a judge, that one short word. I tried to push past her and go in, but she stopped me with her arm. She was wholly mistress of herself, I saw. "Hush," she said in a lower voice. "I've got her round again with brandy. She's sleeping quietly now. We won't disturb her." She drew me farther out into the landing, and as she did so, the clock in the hall below struck 3:30. I had stood, then, 30 minutes in the corridor below. "You've been such a long time," she said simply. "I feared for you," and she took my hand in her own that was cold and clammy. Chapter VI. And then, while that dreadful house stood listening about us in the early hours of this chill morning upon the edge of winter, she told me, with laconic brevity, things about Mabel that I heard as from a distance. There was nothing so unusual or tremendous in the short recital, nothing indeed I might not have already guessed for myself. It was the time and scene, the inference, too, that made it so afflicting. The idea that Mabel believed herself so utterly and hopelessly lost beyond recovery damned. That she had loved him with so passionate a devotion that she had given her soul into his keeping. This certainly I had not divined probably, because I had never thought about it one way or the other. He had converted her, I knew, but that she had subscribed wholeheartedly to that most cruel and ugly of his dogmas this was new to me, and came with a certain shock as I heard it. In love, of course, the weaker nature is receptive to all manner of suggestion. This man had suggested his pet brimstone lake so vividly that she had listened and believed. He had frightened her into heaven, and his heaven, a definite locality in the skies, had its foretaste here on earth in miniature the towers, house, and garden. Into his dolorous scheme of a handful saved and millions damned, his enclosure, as it were, of sheep and goats, he had swept her before she was aware of it. Her mind no longer was her own. And it was Mrs. Marsh who kept the thought stream open, though tempered, as she deemed, with that touch of craven, superstitious mercy. But what I found it difficult to understand, and still more difficult to accept, was that, during her year abroad, she had been so haunted with a secret dread of that hideous after-death that she had finally revolted, and tried to recover that clearer state of mind she had enjoyed before the religious bully had stunned her yet had tried in vain. She had returned to the towers to find her soul again, only to realize that it was lost eternally. The cleaner state of mind lay, then, beyond recovery. In the reaction that followed the removal of his terrible suggestion, she felt the crumbling of all that he had taught her, but searched in vain for the peace and beauty his teachings had destroyed. Nothing came to replace these. She was empty, desolate, hopeless. Craving her former joy and carelessness, she found only hate and diabolical calculation. This man, whom she had loved to the point of losing her soul for him, had bequeathed to her one black and fiery thing, the terror of the damned. His thinking wrapped her in this iron garment that held her fast. All this Frances told me, far more briefly than I have here repeated it. In her eyes and gestures and laconic sentences lay the conviction of great beating issues and of menacing drama my own description fails to recapture. It was all so incongruous and remote from the world I lived in that more than once a smile, though a smile of pity, fluttered to my lips, but a glimpse of my face in the mirror showed rather the leer of a grimace. There was no real laughter anywhere that night. The entire adventure seemed so incredible. Here, in this 20th century but yet delusion, that feeble word did not occur once in the comments my mind suggested though did not utter. I remembered that forbidding shadow too, my sister's watercolors, the vanished personality of our hostess, the inexplicable, thundering noise, and the figure of Mrs. Marsh in her midnight ritual that was so childish yet so horrible. I shivered in spite of my own, emancipated, cast of mind. "There is no Mabel," were the words with which my sister sent another shower of ice down my spine. "He has killed her in his lake of fire and brimstone." I stared at her blankly, as in a nightmare where nothing true or possible ever happened. "He killed her in his lake of fire and brimstone," she repeated more faintly. A desperate effort was in me to say the strong, sensible thing which should destroy the oppressive horror that grew so stiflingly about us both. But again, the mirror drew the attempted smile into the merest grin, betraying the distortion that was everywhere in the place. "You mean," I stammered beneath my breath, "that her faith has gone, but that the terror has remained?" I asked it, dully groping. I moved out of the line of the reflection in the glass. She bowed her head as though beneath a weight. Her skin was the pallor of gray ashes. "You mean," I said louder, "that she has lost her mind." "She is terror incarnate," was the whispered answer. "Mabel has lost her soul is there," she pointed horribly below. "She is seeking it." The word soul stung me into something of my normal self again. "But her terror, poor thing, cannot be transferable to us," I exclaimed more vehemently. "It certainly is not convertible into feelings, sights, and even sounds." She interrupted me quickly, almost impatiently, speaking with that conviction by which she conquered me so easily that night. "It is her terror that revived the others. It has brought her into touch with them. They are loose and driving after her. Her efforts at resistance have given them also hope that escape, after all, is possible. Day and night they strive." Escape others! The anger fast rising in me dropped of its own accord at the moment of birth. It shrank into a shuddering beyond my control. In that moment, I think, I would have believed in the possibility of anything and everything she might tell me. To argue or contradict seemed equally futile. "His strong belief, as also the beliefs of others who have preceded him," she replied, so sure of herself that I actually turned to look over my shoulder, "have left their shadow like a thick deposit over the house and grounds. To them, poor souls imprisoned by thought, it was hopeless as granite walls until her resistance, her effort to dissipate it let in light. Now, in their thousands, they are flocking to this little light, seeking escape. Her own escape, don't you see, may release them all." It took my breath away. Had his predecessors, former occupants of this house, also preached damnation of all the world but their own exclusive sect? Was this the explanation of her obscure talk of layers, each striving against the other for domination? And if men are spirits, and these spirits survive, could strong thought thus determine their condition even afterwards? So many questions flooded into me that I selected no one of them, but stared in uncomfortable silence, bewildered, out of my depth, and acutely, painfully distressed. There was so odd a mixture of possible truth and incredible, unacceptable explanation in it all, so much confirmed, yet so much left darker than before. What she said did, indeed, offer a quasi-interpretation of my own series of abominable sensation strife, agony, pity, hate, escape but so far-fetched that only the deep conviction in her voice and attitude made it tolerable for a second even. I found myself in a curious state of mind. I could neither think clearly nor say a word to refute her amazing statements. Whispered there beside me in the shivering hours of the early morning, with only a wall between ourselves and Mabel. Close behind her words, I remember this singular thing, however, that an atmosphere as of the Inquisition seemed to rise and stir about the room, beating awful wings of black above my head. Abruptly then, a moment's common sense returned to me. I faced her. "And the noise," I said aloud, more firmly, "the roar of the closing doors, we have all heard that. Is that subjective too?" Frances looked sideways about her in a queer fashion that made my flesh creep again. I spoke brusquely, almost angrily. I repeated the question and waited with anxiety for her reply. "What noise?" she asked, with the frank expression of an innocent child. "What closing doors?" But her face turned from gray to white, and I saw that drops of perspiration glistened on her forehead. She caught at the back of a chair to steady herself, then glanced about her again with that sidelong look that made my blood run cold. I understood suddenly then. She did not take in what I said. I knew now. She was listening for something else. And the discovery revived in me a far stronger emotion than any mere desire for immediate explanation. Not only did I not insist upon an answer, but I was actually terrified lest she would answer. More, I felt in me a terror lest I should be moved to describe my own experiences below stairs, thus increasing their reality and so the reality of all. She might even explain them too. Still listening intently, she raised her head and looked me in the eyes. Her lips opened to speak. The words came to me from a great distance, it seemed, and her voice had a sound like a stone that drops into a deep well, its fate though hidden known. We are in it with her too, Bill. We are in it with her. Our interpretations vary because we are in parts of it only. Mabel is in it all. The desire for violence came over me. If only she would say a definite thing in plain King's English. If only I could find it in me to give utterance to what shouted so loud within me. If only the same old cry something would happen, for all this elliptic talk that dazed my mind left obscurity everywhere. Her atrocious meaning, nonetheless, flashed through me, though vanishing before it wholly divulged itself. It brought a certain reaction with it. I found my tongue. Whether I actually believed what I said is more than I can swear to, that it seemed to me wise at the moment is all I remember. My mind was in a state of obscure perception less than that of normal consciousness. Yes, Francis, I believe that what you say is the truth, and that we are in it with her. I meant to say I with loud, hostile emphasis, but instead I whispered it lest she should hear the trembling of my voice. And for that reason, my dear sister, we leave tomorrow, you and I today, rather. Since it is long past midnight we leave this house of the damned. We go back to London. Francis looked up, her face distraught almost beyond recognition. But it was not my words that caused the tumult in her heart. It was the sound she had been listening for so faint I barely caught it myself, and had she not pointed, I could never have known the direction whence it came. Small and terrible, it rose again in the stillness of the night, the sound of gnashing teeth, and behind it came another the tread of stealthy footsteps. Both were just outside the door. The room swung round me for a second. My first instinct to prevent my sister going ouchie had dashed past me frantically to the door gave place to another when I saw the expression in her eyes. I followed her lead instead. It was surer than my own. The pistol in my pocket swung uselessly against my thigh. I was flustered beyond belief, and ashamed that I was so. "Keep close to me, Francis," I said huskily, as the door swung wide and a shaft of light fell upon a figure moving rapidly. Mabel was going down the corridor. Beyond her, in the shadows on the staircase, a second figure stood beckoning, scarcely visible. "Before they get her, quick!" was screamed into my ears, and our arms were about her in the same moment. It was a horrible scene. Not that Mabel struggled in the least, but that she collapsed as we caught her and fell with her dead weight, as of a corpse, limp against us. And her teeth began again. They continued, even beneath the hand that Francis clapped upon her lips. We carried her back into her own bedroom, where she lay down peacefully enough. It was so soon over. The rapidity of the whole thing robbed it of reality almost. It had the swiftness of something remembered rather than of something witnessed. She slept again so quickly that it was almost as if we had caught her sleepwalking. I cannot say. I asked no questions at the time. I have asked none since, and my help was needed as little as the protection of my pistol. Francis was strangely competent and collected. I lingered for some time uselessly by the door, till at length, looking up with a sigh, she made a sign for me to go. "I shall wait in your room next door," I whispered, "till you come." But though going out, I waited in the corridor instead, so as to hear the faintest call for help. In that dark corridor upstairs I waited, but not long. It may have been 15 minutes when Francis reappeared, locking the door softly behind her. Leaning over the banisters, I saw her. "I'll go in again about 6 o'clock, she whispered, "as soon as it gets light. She is sound asleep now. Please don't wait. If anything happens, I'll call you. Might leave your door ajar, perhaps." And she came up, looking like a ghost. But I saw her first safely into bed, and the rest of the night I spent in an armchair close to my open door, listening for the slightest sound. Soon after 5 o'clock, I heard Francis fumbling with the key, and, peering over the railing again, I waited till she reappeared and went back into her own room. She closed her door. Evidently she was satisfied that all was well. Then, and then only, did I go to bed myself, but not to sleep. I could not get the scene out of my mind, especially that odious detail of it which I hoped and believed my sister had not seen, the still, dark figure of the housekeeper waiting on the stairs below, waiting, of course, for Mabel. Chapter X. It seems I became a mere spectator after that. My sister's lead was so assured for one thing, and, for another, the responsibility of leaving Mabel alone. Francis laid it bodily upon my shoulders was a little more than I cared about. Moreover, when we all three met later in the day, things went on so exactly as before, so absolutely without friction or distress, that to present a sudden, obvious excuse for cutting our visit short seemed ill-judged. And on the lowest grounds it would have been desertion. At any rate, it was beyond my powers, and Francis was quite firm that she must stay. We therefore did stay. Things that happen in the night always seem exaggerated and distorted when the sun shines brightly next morning. No one can reconstruct the terror of a nightmare afterwards, nor comprehend why it seemed so overwhelming at the time. I slept till 10 o'clock, and when I rang for breakfast, a note from my sister lay upon the tray, its message of counsel couched in a calm and comforting strain. Mabel, she assured me, was herself again and remembered nothing of what had happened. There was no need of any violent measures. I was to treat her exactly as if I knew nothing. And, if you don't mind, Bill, let us leave the matter unmentioned between ourselves as well. Discussion exaggerates. Such things are best not talked about. I'm sorry I disturbed you so unnecessarily. I was stupidly excited. Please forget all the things I said at the moment. She had written nonsense first instead of things, then scratched it out. She wished to convey that hysteria had been abroad in the night, and I readily gulped the explanation down, though it could not satisfy me in the smallest degree. There was another week of our visit still, and we stayed it out to the end without disaster. My desire to leave at times became that frantic thing, desire to escape, but I controlled it, kept silent, watched and wondered. Nothing happened. As before and everywhere, there was no sequence of development, no connection between cause and effect, and climax, none whatever. The thing swayed up and down, backwards and forwards like a great loose curtain in the wind, and I could only vaguely surmise what caused the draft or why there was a curtain at all. A novelist might mold the queer material into coherent sequence that would be interesting, but could not be true. It remains, therefore, not a story but a history. Nothing happened. Perhaps my intense dislike of the fall of darkness was due wholly to my stirred imagination, and perhaps my anger when I learned that Francis now occupied a bed in our hostess's room was unreasonable. Nerves were unquestionably on edge. I was forever on the lookout for some event that should make escape imperative, but yet that never presented itself. I slept lightly, left my door ajar to catch the slightest sound, even made stealthy tour of the house below stairs while everybody dreamed in their beds. But I discovered nothing. The doors were always locked. I neither saw the housekeeper again in unreasonable times and places, nor heard a footstep in the passages and halls. The noise was never once repeated. That horrible, ultimate thunder, my intensest dread of all, lay withdrawn into the abyss whence it had twice arisen. And though in my thoughts it was sternly denied existence, the great black reason for the fact afflicted me unbelievably. Since Mabel's fruitless effort to escape, the doors kept closed remorselessly. She had failed, they gave up hope. For this was the explanation that haunted the region of my mind where feelings stir and hint before they clothe themselves in actual language. Only I firmly kept it there. It never knew expression. But if my ears were open, my eyes were open too. And it were idle to pretend that I did not notice 100 details that were capable of sinister interpretation had I been weak enough to yield. Some protective barrier had fallen into ruins round me, so that terror stalked behind the general collapse, feeling for me through all the gaping fissures. Much of this, I admit, must have been merely the elaboration of those sensations I had first vaguely felt, before subsequent events and my talks with Francis had dramatized them into living thoughts. I therefore leave them unmentioned in this history, just as my mind left them unmentioned in that interminable final week. Our life went on precisely as before, Mabel unreal and outwardly so still. Francis, secretive, anxious, tactful to the point of slyness, and keen to save to the point of self-forgetfulness. There were the same stupid meals, the same wearisome long evenings, the stifling ugliness of house and grounds, the shadow settling in so thickly that it seemed almost a visible, tangible thing. I came to feel the only friendly things in all this hostile, cruel place were the robins that hopped boldly over the monstrous terraces and even up to the windows of the unsightly house itself. The robins alone knew joy. They danced, believing no evil thing was possible in all God's radiant world. They believed in everybody. Their God's plan of life had no room in it for hell, damnation, and lakes of brimstone. I came to love the little birds. Had Samuel Franklin known them, he might have preached a different sermon, bequeathing love in place of terror. Most of my time I spent writing, but it was a pretense at best, and rather a dangerous one besides. For it stirred the mind to production, with the result that other things came pouring in as well. With reading, it was the same. In the end, I found an aggressive, deliberate resistance to be the only way of feasible defense. To walk far afield was out of the question, for it meant leaving my sister too long alone, so that my exercise was confined to nearer home. My saunters in the grounds, however, never surprised the Goblin Garden again. It was close at hand, but I seemed unable to get wholly into it. Too many things assailed my mind for anyone to hold exclusive possession, perhaps. Indeed, all the interpretations, all the layers, to use my sister's phrase, slipped in by turns and lodged there for a time. They came day and night, and though my reason denied them entrance, they held their own as by a kind of squatter's right. They stirred moods already in me, that is, and did not introduce entirely new ones, for every mind conceals ancestral deposits that have been cultivated in turn along the whole line of its descent. Any day a chance shower may cause this one or that to blossom. Thus it came to me, at any rate. After darkness, the Inquisition paced the empty corridors and set up ghastly apparatus in the dismal halls. And once, in the library, there swept over me that easy and delicious conviction that by confessing my wickedness I could resume it later, since confession is expression, and expression brings relief and leaves one ready to accumulate again. And in such mood, I felt bitter and unforgiving towards all others who thought differently. Another time, it was a pagan thing that assaulted me so trivial, yet so significant at the time when I dreamed that a herd of centaurs rolled up with a great stamping of hoofs round the house to destroy it, and then woke to hear the horses tramping across the field below the lawns. They neighed ominously, and their noisy panting was audible as if it were just outside my windows. But the tree episode, I think, was the most curious of all except, perhaps, the incident with the children, which I shall mention in a moment for its closeness to reality, was so unforgettable. Outside the east window of my room stood a giant Wellingtonia on the lawn, its head rising level with the upper sash. It grew some 20 feet away, planted on the highest terrace, and I often saw it when closing my curtains for the night, noticing how it drew its heavy skirts about it, and how the light from other windows threw glimmering streaks and patches that turned it into the semblance of a towering, solemn image. It stood there then so strikingly, somehow like a great old-world idol, that it claimed attention. Its appearance was curiously formidable. Its branches rustled without visibly moving, and it had a certain portentous, forbidding air, so grand and dark and monstrous in the night that I was always glad when my curtains shut it out. Yet, once in bed, I had never thought about it one way or the other, and by day had certainly never sought it out. One night then, as I went to bed and closed this window against a cutting easterly wind, I saw that there were two of these trees. A brother Wellingtonia rose mysteriously beside it, equally huge, equally towering, equally monstrous. The menacing pair of them faced me there upon the lawn. But in this new arrival lay a strange suggestion that frightened me before I could argue it away. Exact counterpart of its giant companion, it revealed also that gross, odious quality that all my sister's paintings held. I got the odd impression that the rest of these trees, stretching away dimly in a troop over the farther lawns, were similar, and that, led by this enormous pair, they had all moved boldly closer to my windows. At the same moment, a blind was drawn down over an upper room. The second tree disappeared into the surrounding darkness. It was, of course, this chance light that had brought it into the field of vision, but when the black shutter dropped over it, hiding it from view, the manner of its vanishing produced the queer effect that it had slipped into its companion almost, that it had been an emanation of the one I so disliked. and not really a tree at all. In this way, the garden turned vehicle for expressing what lay behind it all. The behavior of the doors, the little, ordinary doors, seems scarcely worth mention at all, their queer way of opening and shutting of their own accord. For this was accountable in 100 natural ways, and to tell the truth, I never caught one in the act of moving. Indeed, only after frequent repetitions did the detail force itself upon me, when, having noticed one, I noticed all. It produced, however, the unpleasant impression of a continual coming and going in the house, as though, screened cleverly and purposely from actual sight, some one in the building held constant, invisible intercourse with others. Upon detailed descriptions of these uncertain incidents, I do not venture, individually so trivial, but taken all together so impressive and so insolent. But the episode of the children, mentioned above, was different, and I give it because it showed how vividly the intuitive child mind received the one impression, at any rate of what was in the air. It may be told in a very few words. I believe they were the coachman's children, and that the man had been in Mr. Franklin's service, but of neither point am I quite positive. I heard screaming in the rose garden that runs along the stable walls. It was one afternoon, not far from the tea hour, and on hurrying up, I found a little girl of 9 or 10 fastened with ropes to a rustic seat, and 2 other children boys, one about 12 and one much younger, gathering sticks beneath the climbing rose trees. The girl was white and frightened, but the others were laughing and talking among themselves so busily while they picked that they did not notice my abrupt arrival. Some game, I understood, was in progress, but a game that had become too serious for the happiness of the prisoner, for there was a fear in the girl's eyes that was a very genuine fear indeed. I unfastened her at once. The ropes were so loosely and clumsily knotted that they had not hurt her skin. It was not that which made her pale. She collapsed a moment upon the bench, then picked up her tiny skirts and dived away at full speed into the safety of the stable-yard. There was no response to my brief comforting, but she ran as though for her life, and I divined that some horrid boy's cruelty had been afoot. It was probably mere thoughtlessness, as cruelty with children usually is, but something in me decided to discover exactly what it was. And the boys, not one whit alarmed at my intervention, merely laughed shyly when I explained that their prisoner had escaped, and told me frankly what their game had been. There was no vestige of shame in them, nor any idea, of course, that they aped a monstrous reality. That it was mere pretense was neither here nor there. To them, though make-believe, it was a make-believe of something that was right and natural and in no sense cruel. Grown-ups did it too. It was necessary for her good. "We was going to burn her up, sir," the older one informed me, answering my why with the explanation, because she wouldn't believe what we wanted her to believe. And game though it was, the feeling of reality about the little episode was so arresting, so terrific in some way, that only with difficulty did I confine my admonitions on this occasion to mere words. The boys slunk off, frightened in their turn, yet not, I felt, convinced that they had erred in principle. It was their inheritance. They had breathed it in with the atmosphere of their bringing up. They would renew the salutary torture when they could till she believed as they did. I went back into the house, afflicted with a passion of mingled pity and distress impossible to describe, yet on my short way across the garden was attacked by other moods in turn, each more real and bitter than its predecessor. I received the whole series, as it were, at once. I felt like a diver rising to the surface through layers of water at different temperatures, though here the natural order was reversed, and the cooler strata were uppermost, the heated ones below. Thus, I was caught by the goblin touch of the willows that fringed the field, by the sensuous curving of the twisted ash that formed a gateway to the little grove of sapling oaks where fawns and satyrs lurked to play in the moonlight before pagan altars, and by the cloaking darkness, next, of the copse of stunted pines, close gathered each to each, where hooded figures stalked behind an awful cross. The episode with the children seemed to have opened me like a knife. The whole place rushed at me. I suspect this synthesis of many moods produced in me that climax of loathing and disgust, which made me feel the limit of bearable emotion had been reached, so that I made straight to find Frances in order to convince her that at any rate I must leave. For, although this was our last day in the house, and we had arranged to go next day, the dread was in me that she would still find some persuasive reason for staying on. And an unexpected incident then made my dread unnecessary. The front door was open, and a cab stood in the drive. A tall, elderly man was gravely talking in the hall with the parlor maid we called the Grenadier. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "I have called to see the house," I heard him say as I ran up the stairs to Frances, who was peering like an inquisitive child over the banisters. "Yes," she told me with a sigh, "I know not whether of resignation or relief. The house is to be let or sold. Mabel has decided. Some society or other, I believe." I was overjoyed. This made our leaving right and possible. "You never told me, Frances." "Mabel only heard of it a few days ago. She told me herself this morning. It is a chance, she says. Alone she cannot get it straight." "Defeat?" I asked, watching her closely. "She thinks she has found a way out. It's not a family, you see. It's a society, a sort of community they go in for thought." "A community?" I gasped. "You mean religious?" She shook her head. "Not exactly," she said, smiling, "but some kind of association of men and women who want a headquarters in the country, a place where they can write and meditate, think, mature their plans, and all the rest. I don't know exactly what." "Utopian dreamers?" I asked, yet feeling an immense relief come over me as I heard. But I asked in ignorance, not cynically. Frances would know. She knew all this kind of thing. "No, not that exactly," she smiled. "Their teachings are grand and simple, old as the world too, really the basis of every religion before men's minds perverted them with their manufactured creeds." Footsteps on the stairs and the sound of voices interrupted our odd impromptu conversation as the Grenadier came up, followed by the tall, grave gentleman who was being shown over the house. My sister drew me along the corridor towards her room, where she went in and closed the door behind me, yet not before I had stolen a good look at the caller long enough, at least, for his face and general appearance to have made a definite impression on me. For something strong and peaceful emanated from his presence. He moved with such quiet dignity. The glance of his eyes was so steady and reassuring that my mind labeled him instantly as a type of man one would turn to in an emergency and not be disappointed. I had seen him but for a passing moment, but I had seen him twice, and the way he walked down the passage, looking competently about him, conveyed the same impression as when I saw him standing at the door, fearless, tolerant, wise. A sincere and kindly character, I judged instantly. A man whom some big kind of love has trained in sweetness towards the world, no hate in him anywhere. A great deal, no doubt, to read in so brief a glance. Yet his voice confirmed my intuition, a deep and very gentle voice, great firmness in it too. Have I become suddenly sensitive to people's atmospheres in this extraordinary fashion? I asked myself, smiling, as I stood in the room and heard the door close behind me. Have I developed some clairvoyant faculty here? At any other time, I should have mocked. And I sat down and faced my sister, feeling strangely comforted and at peace for the first time since I had stepped beneath the tower's roof a month ago. Frances, I then saw, was smiling a little as she watched me. "You know him?" I asked. "You felt it too?" was her question in reply. "No," she added, "I don't know him beyond the fact that he is a leader in the movement and has devoted years and money to its objects. Mabel felt the same thing in him that you have felt and jumped at it." "But you've seen him before," I urged, for the certainty was in me that he was no stranger to her. She shook her head. "He called one day early this week when you were out. Mabel saw him." I believe, she hesitated a moment, as though expecting me to stop her with my usual impatience of such subjects. "I believe he has explained everything to her. The beliefs he embodies, she declares, are her salvation, might be, rather, if she could adopt them. Conversion again, for I remembered her riches and how gladly a society would gobble them. The layers I told you about," she continued calmly, shrugging her shoulders slightly, "the deposits that are left behind by strong thinking and real belief, but especially by ugly, hateful belief, because, you see, unfortunately, there's more vital passion in that sort." "Frances, I don't understand a bit," I said out loud, but said it a little humbly, for the impression the man had left was still strong upon me, and I was grateful for the steady sense of peace and comfort he had somehow introduced. The horrors had been so dreadful. My nerves, doubtless, were more than a little overstrained. Absurd as it must sound, I classed him in my mind with the robins, the happy, confiding robins who believed in everybody and thought no evil. I laughed a moment at my ridiculous idea, and my sister, encouraged by this sign of patience in me, continued more fluently. Of course you don't understand, Bill. Why should you? You've never thought about such things. Needing no creed yourself, you think all creeds are rubbish. I'm open to conviction, I'm tolerant, I interrupted. You're as narrow as Sam Franklin, and as crammed with prejudice, she answered, knowing that she had me at her mercy. Then, pray, what may be his or his society's beliefs? I asked, feeling no desire to argue, and how are they going to prove your Mabel's salvation? Can they bring beauty into all this aggressive hate and ugliness? Certain hope and peace, she said, that peace which is understanding, and that understanding which explains all creeds and therefore tolerates them. Toleration, the one word a religious man loathes above all others. His pet word is damnation. Tolerates them, she repeated patiently, unperturbed by my explosion, because it includes them all. Fine, if true, I admitted, very fine, but how, pray, does it include them all? Because the key word, the motto of their society is, there is no religion higher than truth, and it has no single dogma of any kind. Above all, she went on, because it claims that no individual can be lost. It teaches universal salvation. To damn outsiders is uncivilized, childish, impure. Some take longer than others, it's according to the way they think and live, but all find peace, through development, in the end. What the creeds call a hopeless soul, it regards as a soul having further to go. There is no damnation. Well, well, I exclaimed, feeling that she rode her hobby horse too wildly, too roughly over me. But what is the bearing of all this upon this dreadful place, and upon Mabel? I'll admit that there is this atmosphere, the inexplicable horror in the house and grounds, and that if not of damnation exactly, it is certainly damnable. I'm not too prejudiced to deny that, for I've felt it myself. To my relief, she was brief. She made her statement, leaving me to take it or reject it as I would. The thought and belief its former occupants have left behind. For there has been coincidence here, a coincidence that must be rare. The site on which this modern house now stands was Roman, before that early Britain, with burial mounds, before that again, the Druid stones still lie in that copse below the field, the tumuli among the ilexes behind the drive. The older building Sam Franklin altered and practically pulled down was a monastery. He changed the chapel into a meeting hall, which is now the music room. But before he came here, the house was occupied by Manetti, a violent Catholic without tolerance or vision, and in the interval between these two, Julius Weinbaum had it, Hebrew of most rigid Orthodox type imaginable, so they all have left there. Even so, I repeated, yet interested to hear the rest, what of it? Simply this, said Francis with conviction, that each in turn has left his layer of concentrated thinking and belief behind him, because each believed intensely, absolutely, beyond the least weakening of any doubt, the kind of strong belief and thinking that is rare anywhere today, the kind that wills, impregnates objects, saturates the atmosphere, haunts, in a word. And each, believing he was utterly and finally right, damned with equally positive conviction the rest of the world. One and all preached that implicitly, if not explicitly. It's the root of every creed. Last of the bigoted, grim series came Samuel Franklin. I listened in amazement that increased as she went on. Up to this point, her explanation was so admirable. It was, indeed, a pretty study in psychology if it were true. Then why does nothing ever happen? I inquired mildly. A place so thickly haunted ought to produce a crop of no ordinary results. There lies the proof, she went on in a lowered voice, the proof of the horror and the ugly reality. The thought and belief of each occupant in turn kept all the others under. They gave no sign of life at the time, but the results of thinking never die. They crop out again the moment there's an opening. And, with the return of Mabel in her negative state, believing nothing positive herself, the place, for the first time, found itself free to reproduce its buried stores. Damnation, hellfire, and the rest, the most permanent and vital thought of all those creeds, since it was applied to the majority of the world, broke loose again, for there was no restraint to hold it back. Each sought to obtain its former supremacy. None conquered. there results a pandemonium of hate and fear, of striving to escape, of agonized, bitter warring to find safety, peace, salvation. The place is saturated by that appalling stream of thinking, the terror of the damned. It concentrated upon Mabel, whose negative attitude furnished the channel of deliverance. You and I, according to our sympathy with her, were similarly involved. Nothing happened because no one layer could ever gain the supremacy. I was so interested, I dare not say amused, that I stared in silence while she paused a moment, afraid that she would draw rein and end the fairy tale too soon. The beliefs of this man, of his society rather, vigorously thought and therefore vigorously given out here, will put the whole place straight. It will act as a solvent. These vitriolic layers, actively denied, will fuse and disappear in the stream of gentle, tolerant sympathy which is love. For each member, worthy of the name, loves the world, and all creeds go into the melting pot. Mabel, too, if she joins them out of real conviction, will find salvation. Thinking, I know, is of the first importance, I objected. But don't you, perhaps, exaggerate the power of feeling and emotion, which in religion are au fond always hysterical? What is the world, she told me, but thinking and feeling? An individual's world is entirely what that individual thinks and believes interpretation. There is no other, and unless he really thinks and really believes, he has no permanent world at all. I grant that few people think and still fewer believe, and that most take ready-made suits and make them do. Only the strong make their own things. The lesser fry, Mabel among them, are merely swept up into what has been manufactured for them. They get along somehow. You and I have made for ourselves, Mabel has not. She is a nonentity, and when her belief is taken from her, she goes with it. It was not in me, just then, to criticize the evasion or pick out the sophistry from the truth. I merely waited for her to continue. None of us have truth, my dear Francis, I ventured presently, seeing that she kept silent. Precisely, she answered, but most of us have beliefs, and what one believes and thinks affects the world at large. Consider the legacy of hatred and cruelty involved in the doctrines men have built into their creeds, where the sine qua non of salvation is absolute acceptance of one particular set of views, or else perishing everlastingly, for only by repudiating history can they disavow it. You're not quite accurate, I put in. Not all the creeds teach damnation, do they? Franklin did, of course, but the others are a bit modernized now, surely. Trying to get out of it, she admitted. Perhaps they are, but damnation of unbelievers of most of the world, that is their rather favorite idea if you talk with them. I never have. She smiled. But I have, she said significantly. So, if you consider what the various occupants of this house have so strongly held and thought and believed, you need not be surprised that the influence they have left behind them should be a dark and dreadful legacy. For thought, you know, does leave. The opening of the door, to my great relief, interrupted her, as the grenadier led in the visitor to see the room. He bowed to both of us with a brief word of apology, looked round him, and withdrew, and with his departure the conversation between us came naturally to an end. I followed him out. Neither of us in any case, I think, cared to argue further. And so far as I am aware, the curious history of the towers ends here too. There was no climax in the story sense. Nothing ever really happened. We left next morning for London. I only know that the society in question took the house and have since occupied it to their entire satisfaction, and that Mabel, who became a member shortly afterwards, now stays there frequently when in need of repose from the arduous and unselfish labors she took upon herself under its aegis. She dined with us only the other night, here in our tiny Chelsea flat, and a jollier, saner, more interesting and happy guest I could hardly wish for. She was vital in the best sense. The lay figure had come to life. I found it difficult to believe she was the same woman whose fearful effigy had floated down those dreary corridors and almost disappeared in the depths of that atrocious shadow. What her beliefs were now I was wise enough to leave unquestioned, and Francis, to my great relief, kept the conversation well away from such inappropriate topics. It was clear, however, that the woman had in herself some secret source of joy, that she was now an aggressive, positive force, sure of herself, and apparently afraid of nothing in heaven or hell. She radiated something very like hope and courage about her, and talked as though the world were a glorious place and everybody in it kind and beautiful. Her optimism was certainly infectious. The towers were mentioned only in passing. The name of Marsh came up, not the marsh, it so happened, but a name in some book that was being discussed, and I was unable to restrain myself. Curiosity was too strong. I threw out a casual inquiry Mabel could leave unanswered if she wished, but there was no desire to avoid it. Her reply was frank and smiling. "Would you believe it? She married," Mabel told me, though obviously surprised that I remembered the housekeeper at all, "and is happy as the day is long. She's found her right niche in life, a sergeant." "The army," I ejaculated. "Salvation Army," she explained merrily. Frances exchanged a glance with me. I laughed too, for the information took me by surprise. I cannot say why exactly, but I expected at least to hear that the woman had met some dreadful end, not impossibly by burning. "And the towers, now called the rest house," Mabel chattered on, "seems to me the most peaceful and delightful spot in England." "Really?" I said politely. "When I lived there in the old days while you were there, perhaps, though I won't be sure." Mabel went on. The story got abroad that it was haunted. Wasn't it odd? A less likely place for a ghost I've never seen. Why, it had no atmosphere at all. She said this to Frances, glancing up at me with a smile that apparently had no hidden meaning. "Did you notice anything queer about it when you were there?" This was plainly addressed to me. "I found it difficult to settle down to anything," I said, after an instant's hesitation. "I couldn't work there." "But I thought you wrote that wonderful book on the deaf and blind while you stayed with me," she asked innocently. I stammered a little. "Oh no, not then. I only made a few notes at the towers. My mind, oddly enough, refused to produce it all down there. But why do you ask? Was anything supposed to happen there?" She looked searchingly into my eyes a moment before she answered. "Not that I know of," she said simply. Thanks for listening to The Damned by Algernon Blackwood